Thank you, Ian. It's great to be here with all of you on this beginning of this important day. So first, though, on behalf of GPE, I am delighted to welcome you all to the fifth KIX Global Symposium. It is my great pleasure to be co-hosting this symposium with our core implementing partner for KIX, the International Development Research Center. So let me frame our discussion a little bit with a few points. First, we are pleased to see that after 5 years, KIX is active in 86 GPE partner countries and funds research by 150 partners, of which nearly 80% are based in the Global South. In these 5 years, 370 outputs from KIX hubs and research grants have led to 267 recorded instances of national policy use, citation, or intention to implement. In addition, over 76,000 policy stakeholders have participated in more than 1,700 KIX Hub and research grant events. That's a lot of figures, but these figures indicate that KIX is adding real value for partners by identifying what works in transforming education systems. Second, this research is essential because delivering quality education is more important and urgent than ever. 2022, it was estimated that 7 in 10 children in lower income countries could not comprehend a simple text by age 10. And yet education is critical to broad-based prosperity in the Global South, given the rapid growth of the workforce age population, especially in Africa. In only 25 years, Africa will have the largest workforce in the world, surpassing China and India. We must act with urgency to ensure that that workforce will have the skills needed to lead and shape the global economy. Education is also critical to the stability and resilience of partner countries and of our world. We know that countries that invest in education are more likely to be stable, and that stability leads to more investment in education. We also know that investment in 21st century skills, including reasoning, problem solving, and teamwork, so important to the workplace, are also critical to combating extremism. And we know that while education systems are battered by climate change, quality education is essential for the resilience of communities and nations in the face of extreme climate events. Third, we know that no one can bring about education transformation alone. Many actors, individuals, and institutions make up and shape education systems. In fact, many of those actors work in other sectors, such as health and business and climate change. To ensure education systems are fit for the 21st century, we must work with a wide range of partners, teachers, parents, and leaders at all levels and across sectors to leverage their comparative advantages. KIX provides a valued platform to do just that, connecting researchers, policymakers, and other stakeholders, including civil society and teachers. It is instrumental to creating an inclusive partnership, a mutually accountable partnership, and a partnership that shares and acts on that knowledge through transformative education reforms. Today, we are excited to have senior government officials discussing with civil society, global knowledge actors, and technical colleagues and partners about the roles they play and how those insights can strengthen cultures of evidence use in formulating and implementing policy reform. It is not enough to generate evidence of what works in education and it responds to national priorities and challenges. That evidence must be relevant and accessible to those who make and implement policy. It is these mechanics between the actors engaged in evidence generation and those in its use that are the focus of this year's symposium. Better understanding these dynamics helps ensure policy leads to action and transformed education systems. And fourth, for GPE, this symposium is very timely as we are developing our next strategic plan, GPE 2030, and preparing for our next replenishment. The symposium holds potential to provide deep insights on how GPE can better support system transformation. The symposium theme and discussions may also inform how GPE can better work with partners to address the regional opportunities and challenges they face. In conclusion, I'd like to acknowledge and thank everyone involved in KIX, IDRC, the organizations running the KIX hubs, the applied research grantees, and the large number of country stakeholders engaged with its research, knowledge, and capacity strengthening activities. I am convinced that the work of KIX and the engagement of different partners and the insights KIX generates will continue to inform our collective efforts to ensure every child has access to quality education fit for an evolving world. I am excited to hear the deliberations of the next 2 days and wish you an excellent and informative event. So with that, let me pass over to Julie Delahanty, the President of International Development Research Center. Julie, over to you.
Merci Charles pour vos remarques et pour l'excellente collaboration entre le GPI et le Centre de recherche pour le développement international. Bonjour à tous, c'est un plaisir d'être avec vous pour le symposium de KIX de cette année. C'est toujours un privilège pour le CRDI de co-investir dans le GPI KIX et de gérer sa mise en œuvre. KIX isn't just a tool, really, it's a game changer. By empowering decision makers with robust data and scaling solutions that have already been proven, KIX is paving the way for a brighter future for education. KIX is focused on putting strong research into the hands of decision makers, and scaling what works is really essential in a world where, according to UNESCO, 251 million children and youth remain out of school worldwide. In nearly 10 years, that figure has come down by only 1%. At IDRC, we champion applied, localized research and encourage local innovation to solve pressing challenges. We recognize the power of working with others to drive positive change, and we respect the fact that those experiencing a challenge are best placed to identify and implement the solution. KIX embodies this approach, and I want to give you an example of that. Teachers play a huge role in shaping students' learning and growth. They spark curiosity and they drive ambition. So it made perfect sense for the University of Dar es Salaam to spearhead research in Tanzania, Kenya, and Zambia to find new ways for teachers to boost math performance. With KIX's support, they created a teacher training and mentorship program based on solid evidence. This program shifted the teaching style from being teacher-focused and theoretical to being much more student-focused and practical. For instance, they started using simple teaching aids and real-life objects to make math more relatable and more fun. And the new approach is really working. When this project kicked off in 2021, only 17% of Tanzania's Dodoma region passed the math section of their national exam. But after implementing the new approach, the pass rate jumped to 27% in 2022. And in 2023, it skyrocketed to 53%, earning the school recognition for its academic excellence. This approach is being scaled up in collaboration with ministries of education and teachers' colleges through its inclusion in ongoing teacher training. Plans are now underway to adapt and expand the model to South Sudan. This shows how teachers and decision makers in GPE partner countries are using evidence to make education more effective, more relevant, and more fun. Momentum is building as decision makers, such as those working in ministries of education, see the benefits not only of using research to inform decision making, but of co-creating evidence with researchers so that it is purpose-driven and positioned for use. Today's sessions focus on building a broader culture of evidence use in education systems. Tomorrow, we're going to have the opportunity to hear the University of Dar es Salaam and Tanzania's Ministry of Education explain how they work together to scale the impact of the teacher training and mentorship approach. Other grantees and policymakers will also present how they've used research to inform decision-making in education priorities, such as gender equality in education, data systems and data use, and how to support out-of-school children and youth. During this time together, I encourage you to focus on the steps we can take towards a future where the process of creating and using evidence is more systematic. In that future, we're not working on a collection of projects, but rather methodically and collaboratively building and supporting knowledge ecosystems. Nous avons tous un rôle essentiel à jouer. La construction d'écosystèmes nécessite la contribution de toutes les parties prenantes à la table. La diversité des participants ici présents aujourd'hui fait de cette réunion une occasion unique de faire ce travail ensemble. Nous apprécions le travail de GPI pour réunir les gouvernements, les organismes subventionnaires, les multilatéraux, la société civile et d'autres afin de s'assurer que tout le monde est aligné aux priorités définies par les pays à faible et à moyen revenu. KIX contribue à ces efforts de mobilisation. Plus de 150 organisations mettent en œuvre la recherche financée par KIX et renforcent le système de connaissances pour l'éducation. Ensemble, nous pouvons soutenir l'amélioration des connaissances et des données probantes afin de contribuer à l'amélioration des systèmes éducatifs dans le monde entier. Et cela pourra contribuer aussi à surmonter les effets de l'aggravation des crises mondiales. Je vous souhaite de bien profiter de votre temps ensemble. Merci beaucoup. Ian, back to you.
Merci beaucoup, Julie. Many thanks to you, Charles. We will now pass to our next input, which is our first moderated panel. If we could have the next slide, please. Thank you so much. I'm going to introduce our moderator for this panel. Dr. Javier Gonzalez is director and co-founder of SUMMA, the Education Research and Innovation Laboratory for Latin America and the Caribbean, where he advises and works collaboratively with the authorities of the Ministries of Education, 21 Latin America and Caribbean countries. SUMMA is the implementing partner for the KIX LAC Hub, together with the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. I'll pass over to Javier to introduce our distinguished panelists. Javier, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you to GPE, IDRC, and different partners that are here today. It's a very, very important topic for KIX and for the Global South, really, because it's the only way for systems, educational systems, to really improve in the long run through knowledge. I will just want to frame the discussion, the real important panel that we have now with very distinguished guests, just by saying two main issues. One, of course, and it has been said already, the importance of strengthening ecosystems of knowledge, of research and innovation in education in our regions throughout the South, all over the world. In Latin America, especially, where SUMMA is based and works with more than 20 countries, we have done 8 studies of ecosystems of research, innovation, and knowledge. And we have identified 6 main points or characteristics that show the weakness and the challenges that are attached to our ecosystems. First, we have discovered that there's a weak governance of our ecosystems. That means basically the lack of capacity to coordinate, to set agendas, and therefore to set priorities. These are things, of course, that GPE, through the KIX Hub, is working towards solving. A second very important structural fact that characterizes our ecosystems have to do with the low level of funding going towards R&D. Third, the need to strengthen our local universities and centers of research in order to generate pertinent knowledge from the Global South. And that entails, among other things, not only strengthening the capacity of the researchers, but also to be able to access journals and knowledge from the Global North. We also find the importance of strengthening the intensity of South-South face-to-face exchange. And that is really key to promote and exchange tacit knowledge. And finally, the importance of strengthening the link between those knowledge producers and those who use evidence and knowledge. Now, the second point I wanted to make has to do with this second point, the link between universities and knowledge producers and those who use it at the state level. We know that it is not a linear process. We have to, I think, better understand that these ecosystems of knowledge are embedded within a political settlement. And we have to acknowledge the politics of policy reform in order to understand what is the importance of ecosystems and what is the role that ecosystems of knowledge can play for educational reform. So I just wanted to make the point of trying to, and we should be going into a better understanding of these ecosystems and moving again from this very linear perspective in a nutshell, thinking that just more areas will automatically translate into better policies and moving into a better understanding of the politics of the policy reform, where drivers such as cultural change, such a definitely increase of knowledge, but especially power struggle plays a key role. With that, I would like to welcome our very distinguished panelists that we have here today. I will switch between Spanish and English, depending on who this panelist is, in order to be more equitable regarding the language used within this panel. So let me first start by introducing the Minister of Education of Honduras, Mr. Daniel Esponda. Also, I would like to introduce Laura Giannecchini, who is the Institutional Development Coordinator from the Latin American Campaign for the Right to Education, CLADE. Raúl Chacón, which is the Director of KIX Lac Hub at SUMMA. Katherina Hruskovec Gonzalez, who is the Country Engagement Lead from GBE. And finally, Donika Dimovska, Chief Knowledge Officer from Jacobs Foundation. So I would ask you all to please, let's say you have all your cameras on, and therefore I will start. We will have 2 rounds of questions. For each round of question, each speaker will have around 5 minutes, hopefully no more than that, in order to be equitable also with the rest of the next panel. So as I said, we will have these 2 rounds of questions. I will ask the Minister of Education, Daniel Esponda, and Raúl Chacón to speak in Spanish. The rest of the speakers, if they prefer, they can speak in English, so that we have more or less an equitable panel in that sense. And then finally, we will have around 20 to 25 minutes for Q&As, for questions and answers from our panelists. So again, thank you already for being with us. So the first question has to do with, what do ecosystems for evidence use in national policy making look like in the Global South, especially in a region? Who is involved and how do they operate? So I will now change to Spanish and will give you just a few seconds so that you can switch in terms of translation. Ministro Esponda, entonces lo que preguntaba yo en la primera ronda tiene que ver con cuáles son las principales características del ecosistema de evidencia y de uso de evidencia, en este caso en Honduras, quiénes están involucrados, quiénes son los principales actores y cómo opera y cómo funciona este ecosistema. Muchas gracias, ministro.
Buenos días, muchísimas gracias al GPE y a todos y todas las que hacen posible este simposio. Para nosotros esto es un espacio muy importante, dado que en el país, y eso yo lo he insistido muchísimo ya en casi poquito más de mis 3 años al frente de la Secretaría de Educación, y es que nuestros sistemas educativos están enseñando ciencia muerta, es decir, los profesores estamos investigando muy poco, las profesoras estamos investigando muy poco, y los ministerios en el fondo también investigan poco. Es decir, estamos reproduciendo contenidos sin mayores análisis y sin mayores investigaciones. En el caso de Honduras tenemos a la DGDP, que es nuestra Dirección General de Formación Permanente. Se hacen enormes esfuerzos, digamos, ¿verdad?, por poder hacer investigaciones que lleguen al salón de clase, que para mí, Javier, ese es uno de los elementos más importantes. ¿Cómo hacemos investigaciones que lleguen al salón de clase? Y cuando planteamos que lleguen al salón de clase, nos referimos a que esas investigaciones se conviertan en conclusiones que permitan que los profesores hagan modificaciones en sus herramientas pedagógicas y didácticas para mejorar el impacto de la calidad de los niños y de las niñas. ¿Cómo funciona el ecosistema? Pues bueno, en la actualidad, en la administración del gobierno de la presidenta Xiomara, nosotros estamos haciendo procesos en alianza con el sector privado, con algunos aliados internacionales para poder hacer investigaciones pertinentes, que ese es el otro elemento importante. Nosotros identificamos que la mayor parte de los países de la región, particularmente en Honduras ocurría muchísimo, quien define las agendas de temas que se van a investigar son precisamente los cooperantes y no necesariamente el país. Es decir, que cuando a un ministro le llegan investigaciones y como no se están haciendo muchas, terminan aceptando los temas que le plantean o que en alguna medida se le imponen. Pero eso entonces en el fondo no tiene un gran impacto, digamos, en el salón de clase o en la realidad del sistema. ¿Qué es lo que nosotros hicimos o qué es lo que nosotros hemos venido haciendo? Bueno, desde que yo llegué al ministerio hicimos una mesa de cooperantes donde participan todos los actores. Y en esa mesa de cooperantes nosotros dijimos, este es nuestro plan de trabajo, esos son los temas que nos interesan y por favor pedimos a toda la colaboración y a la cooperación internacional que sobre este camino podamos desplazarnos para alcanzar los objetivos que tenemos. En ese caso, nosotros planteamos, por ejemplo, dentro del marco de nuestro plan 365, que tiene 3 pilares, 6 elementos y 5 objetivos, y por el tiempo no lo voy a profundizar, pero por ejemplo, el inicial es el tema de la alimentación escolar. Entonces, siempre nos preguntan que hay niños fuera de las escuelas, que hay niñas fuera de la escuela. Por supuesto, nosotros hemos mejorado los rendimientos de la matrícula y hemos mejorado la retención de la matrícula porque le hemos dado un especial énfasis a la alimentación escolar. Entonces, ¿qué planteamos nosotros en el tema de cómo se produce, por ejemplo, que era una de tus preguntas? Nosotros sabíamos, sin hacer mayores investigaciones en el país, que implementar la alimentación escolar nos iba a ayudar a mejorar la matrícula. Del año 2018 al año, del año 2016 al año 2021, nuestra matrícula venía en caída libre. Es decir, todos los años perdíamos alrededor de 100.000 escolares. ¿Qué hicimos nosotros al inicio de nuestro gobierno? Comenzamos nuevamente lo más rápido que pudimos con la alimentación escolar. Y no comenzó a partir de primer grado como había sido históricamente en el país. Comenzamos con una alimentación escolar a partir de la educación inicial. Y la ampliamos al tercer ciclo, es decir, a séptimo, octavo y noveno. Eso nos ha permitido mejorar nuestra matrícula. Ahora, ¿qué es lo importante de las investigaciones que estamos haciendo? Estamos tratando de medir el rendimiento de los niños y de las niñas antes, durante y después de la alimentación escolar. Ahora, desde luego que encontramos hallazgos importantes. Por ejemplo, lo que nosotros entregamos son raciones secas, es decir, frijoles, arroz, maíz, dependiendo de la región, harina de trigo, ¿verdad? Y el gobierno todavía no ha llegado al nivel de ampliar, por ejemplo, el tema de las raciones frescas. Nosotros, a través de nuestras investigaciones y del trabajo que estamos haciendo con la construcción del modelo de educación rural, que es otro tema que también lo estamos investigando, comenzamos a agregar raciones frescas. Pero son experiencias muy chiquititas. Son experiencias que nos han servido para validar lo que nosotros pensábamos. Ahora, aquí es donde viene el otro tema. ¿Quién lo consume? Es decir, ¿cómo sirven esas investigaciones? Porque va a parecer hasta tonto lo que les voy a decir, pero todavía tenemos comunidades rurales, por ejemplo, donde la sociedad no ha entendido que la educación inicial es un derecho, donde todavía no se comprende que la alimentación escolar también es un derecho. Entonces, esto nos ha permitido para llegar a las madres, a los padres de familia, para que nos ayuden a producir alimentos en la Red Nacional de Escuelas Agrícolas. Y las escuelas donde tenemos raciones secas del gobierno y raciones frescas de las que se producen en terreno, están teniendo un mejor desempeño, ha mejorado sustancialmente la matrícula y la permanencia, es decir, hemos aumentado o hemos garantizado casi el 100% de la permanencia de la matrícula. Entonces, a mí me parece, Javier, que es supremamente importante que cada una de que los ecosistemas de investigación que se generan en los países se puedan generar desde los territorios, con los profesores, con las profesoras y sobre todo garantizando que estas investigaciones tengan pertinencia. De lo contrario, nos vamos a llenar de toneladas de investigaciones, de toneladas de papers que no nos van a conducir a soluciones a los problemas que tenemos.
Muchas gracias, ministro. Muchas gracias también por los tiempos. Veo que vamos muy bien encaminados. Muchas gracias, ministro, por su intervención. Quisiera darle la palabra a Laura. I would like to now speak, I'll turn into English. Laura, although you're from Brazil, so please, maybe I made a mistake. I assigned the language according to what I thought it could be better, but I think I will leave it to each speaker to talk in their native language and whichever they choose. So please, Laura and Katherina, definitely feel free to speak in your mother tongue. So Laura, please, you come from civil society, from CLADE, and therefore also it would be interesting to see how you see, and you're from Brazil, how you see this development of ecosystems from a country which we know has grown a lot in terms of its capacity to research, but also historically in terms of innovation. What do you see? How do you see this ecosystem evolving? But most importantly, what is the role of social society in this trajectory? Thank you.
Gracias, Javier. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Gracias por permitir hablarme no en mi idioma materno, que es el portugués, pero el español, que es mi idioma de trabajo. Y tú sabes que nuestra región es muy diversa. Y esa diversidad se refleja en los ecosistemas de uso de evidencia para la realización de políticas públicas y cómo la sociedad civil puede usar esa información para transformar los sistemas públicos. Entonces, por un lado tenemos el caso de Brasil, como tú mencionabas, ¿no? Donde hay importantes institutos nacionales de producción de información e investigación especializados en educación y que son capaces de generar censos escolares, colectando anualmente los datos sobre la situación de todas las escuelas de educación en primera infancia, en educación básica, en educación secundaria, en educación de personas jóvenes y adultas, educación profesional y tecnológica y hasta educación superior. Tenemos la experiencia del censo escolar brasileño desde el 1995. Entonces, eso es una experiencia riquísima y que se hace de manera articulada entre el nivel municipal, departamental y nacional. Entonces, el ente federal hace el cronograma, produce los instrumentos para tener la misma información desde todas las escuelas. Las secretarías municipales y departamentales son responsables por garantizar el cronograma, por brindar capacitación de cómo llenar estos formularios y finalmente los dirigentes, los y las dirigentes escolares son los que van a llenar estos formatos. Entonces, es muy interesante porque esta información es pública, de acceso libre, y aunque durante el gobierno de Jair Bolsonaro una parte de los datos se cerró, eso sigue permitiendo al Estado crear una serie de indicadores para monitorear la política educativa y también ir haciendo el seguimiento a la implementación del Plan Nacional de Educación que tiene 10 años. Por otro lado, esto permite a académicos hacer investigaciones independientes, revisadas entre pares, con más detalles, que analizan series históricas, contribuyen para analizar los cuellos de botella, desarrollar una mirada crítica sobre las políticas. También desde sociedad civil eso permite una gestión democrática y participativa de las políticas. Podemos hacer recomendaciones para el ajuste de políticas y observando incluso grupos muy específicos que están fuera de la escuela, que tienen un peor desempeño. Y eso nos permite intentar ir ecualizando para que el derecho humano a la educación de todos y todas se cumpla. Claro que no siempre toda la producción de ese conocimiento es aprovechado para efectivamente cambiar el sistema educativo. Ahora, por otro lado, hay países como Haití, donde tenemos un censo que se realizó en el 2015 y que solo ahora empieza a ser reelaborado. Entonces, esperar tanto tiempo para recabar esta información dificulta el monitoreo acurado de la situación y de la planificación de los ajustes de las políticas educativas. También impide la realización de investigaciones en profundidad. En el caso de Haití, aún más, donde solo el 30% de los niños y niñas culminan la primaria y solo un 20% de niños y niñas están en la secundaria inscritos, habría que pensar en mirar no solo para el censo escolar, pero de manera más amplia para la población en edad escolar y para aquellos que están fuera del sistema. Entonces, es por eso que nuestro miembro en Haití, la REPT, está abogando porque el Estado incluya esa información en el nuevo censo. Entre estos dos polos hay una situación diversa de sistemas que amerita análisis de más profundidad, pero quería mencionar solo de manera complementaria la importancia del desarrollo no solo de análisis cuantitativos a partir del censo, pero también de análisis cualitativos que permitan monitorear otros elementos que los datos estadísticos no dan cuenta. Entonces, cómo se dan los procesos de enseñanza, los procesos pedagógicos, las discriminaciones en la escuela, en las aulas. Todo eso permite calificar las políticas de manera complementaria y en nuestra región viene siendo desarrollando de manera increíble y con alta calidad por investigadores e investigadoras, por la sociedad civil. Entonces, cruzando toda esta información, creo que podemos promover muchos cambios en los sistemas de nuestra región. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think it's so important that you mentioned to include information on invisibilized populations, such as those of indigenous population, migrants, I would add impatient youth, LGBTI population, etc., which usually are overlooked in our general statistics, and we need to better know in order to make more inclusive systems. I will turn now to Raúl, Raúl Chacón. You are, of course, playing from the KIX Hub, the GPE, this very important GPE IDRC initiative, which is playing definitely a role in Latin America, in Central America specifically, in the Caribbean. So to you, Raúl, please go ahead.
Gracias, Javier. Buenos días, buenas tardes también a todos y a todas las participantes de este simposio. Es un gusto estar acá y, por supuesto partir agradeciendo la invitación, señalar que desde SUMMA, junto a la Organización de Estados del Caribe Oriental, y en coordinación permanente con la Alianza Mundial, con GPE y el IDRC de Canadá, hemos trabajado de manera incansable para promover el mejoramiento educativo en América Latina y el Caribe. Y específicamente el compromiso nuestro tiene que ver con informar el desarrollo de políticas y programas educativos con evidencia nacional e internacional. Y aquí juega un papel central la idea de colaborar en el sur, pero también con el norte. Hay dinámicas muy interesantes que queremos seguir potenciando. Por supuesto, agradecemos también el compromiso de los distintos actores de los 10 países que conforman el KIX Hub para América Latina y el Caribe, en particular los países de Centroamérica y el Caribe Oriental, quienes han venido trabajando de manera permanente en un diálogo productivo de intercambios junto con otros investigadores también y policymakers o formuladores de política, sociedad civil y, por supuesto sindicatos docentes. Es un diálogo que permite aprender y que va construyendo esta comunidad esta comunidad que conforma el ecosistema de colaboración en nuestra región. Destacar, por supuesto, el trabajo directo que hacemos con los ministerios de educación como líderes responsables primeros del mejoramiento de los estados nacionales y al mismo tiempo haciendo todos los esfuerzos para que las coordinaciones y sinergias se produzcan con los distintos actores e instituciones que conforman parte del ecosistema en la región y también en cada país. La sociedad civil, aquí nuestra compañera de CLADE, ha estado muy presente también en todas nuestras conversaciones y diálogos que permiten efectivamente hacer sentido de manera conjunta entre lo que significa incorporar evidencia, conocimiento, investigación, lo que significa desde el punto de vista de aportar al derecho a la educación, como ya se señalaba, y particularmente con un foco en justicia educativa, que aborda los desafíos de aquellas poblaciones que históricamente han estado más desaventajadas y que no necesariamente son minoritarias. Yo creo que es importante pensar que hay una parte importante de la región que sufre de las dificultades no solo de calidad educativa, que a veces nos enfocamos en eso, sino también incluso en acceso y en la posibilidad de mantenerse en el sistema. Yo creo que estamos discutiendo cada vez más respecto y en profundidad respecto a la realidad regional, pero también de cada uno de los países. Y tenemos algunas experiencias concretas sobre las cuales hemos venido desarrollando estos mecanismos de intercambio, diálogo, aprendizaje, como por ejemplo los ciclos de movilización de conocimiento, que son temáticos, que hoy día van conformando una comunidad de práctica en uso de evidencia, con las distintas instituciones y perspectivas, por supuesto que hacen que aprendamos unos de otros y al mismo tiempo informemos el desarrollo educativo de políticas y programas. En particular, cuando uno habla de uso de evidencia en términos generales, lo va aterrizando y lo hemos venido haciendo con la comunidad KIX en América Latina y el Caribe. Poniendo énfasis en el desarrollo de sistemas de monitoreo y evaluación de aprendizajes, desde la sala de clases hasta las evaluaciones nacionales que permiten medir nuestros avances. Por supuesto, eso acompañado de la discusión de fortalecimiento de sistemas de datos, que son esenciales también para contar con información válida, robusta y confiable. Y lo mismo respecto entonces a los especialistas de la propia región. Nos encanta poder aprender de lo que cada país está realizando desde la sociedad civil, desde los sindicatos, gremios docentes y por supuesto también desde las políticas gubernamentales. Nos encanta poner en discusión lo que está ocurriendo, por ejemplo, hoy día en las políticas de primera infancia. Yo creo que es una prioridad también que la región comparte. Así que hemos hecho algunos intercambios, también la evidencia para ponerla en discusión. También se compone de aprender unos de otros y hemos desarrollado algunas visitas técnicas de aprendizaje donde delegaciones de unos países van a otros países de la región a aprender y compartir, intercambiar respecto a temáticas prioritarias comunes y sobre las cuales entonces vamos construyendo una agenda que cada vez está más informada y por lo tanto son prioridades que son respondidas con evidencia comparada por un lado y por otro lado con evidencia, investigación, evaluaciones que se van produciendo específicamente en la región. Así que quizás para tener una primera aproximación a estas comunidades y ecosistemas de innovación e investigación que estamos empujando en la región.
Thank you so much, Raúl, and maybe for stressing the point of this bottom-up approach that does not exclude the fact that we're trying to identify priorities with governments, but the important thing is that we're doing also with academics, NGOs, and different actors, including, of course, very importantly, teacher unions. I would like to turn to Katherina. Katherina, of course, she's playing a leading role in the region, promoting and coordinating the different instruments that GPE has, and that are, well, targeted towards strengthening the ecosystems of knowledge. So over to you, Katherina.
Muchísimas gracias, Javier, y al equipo de KIX por la invitación para participar en este panel con tan distinguidos panelistas. Es un gran gusto para mí estar aquí. Bueno, para responder tu pregunta, Javier, para nosotros, por el lado de GPE, esos ecosistemas a los que tú te refieres guardan mucha similitud con lo que nosotros llamamos grupos locales de educación a nivel de los países, ¿no? Los grupos locales de educación más allá, es un término general que nosotros utilizamos en GPE para hablar de las mesas sectoriales, los grupos de actores que participan en el sector educativo, que normalmente están liderados con firmeza por el gobierno y donde participan pues actores tanto nacionales como internacionales, ¿no? Los actores nacionales en muchos casos incluyen el sector privado, la empresa privada, las organizaciones docentes, las organizaciones de padres y representantes, las organizaciones estudiantiles, etcétera. Y por el lado internacional, pues en muchos casos involucran también a la banca multilateral, las organizaciones de Naciones Unidas, la cooperación internacional, etcétera, ¿no? Y el propósito que GPE trata de promover para estos grupos locales de educación es que identifiquen en conjunto una prioridad o las prioridades clave para el sector y que todos se aglutinen o respalden a esa prioridad y que de alguna manera como un barco, pues, que todos rememos en la misma dirección. Y lo que tú decías, Javier, al principio llamó mi atención, ¿verdad? Porque una de las cosas que nosotros hemos visto en GPE a lo largo de nuestra experiencia trabajando no solo con países de Latinoamérica, sino a nivel mundial, es que el sistema educativo en muchos casos se ve por los distintos actores que hacen bien el sistema educativo, se ve al lado en distintas direcciones, ¿no? Y el propósito que nosotros tratamos de promover con los grupos locales de educación por el lado de GPE es justamente alinear a todos esos actores para que avancen hacia el alcance de una prioridad sectorial, ¿no? Y que de alguna manera todos esos actores pues definan planes de trabajo, definan acciones, definan estrategias que le permitan al país avanzar hacia esa prioridad y que cada uno de ellos pues tenga una contribución, puede ser una contribución incluso con recursos financieros para el alcance de esa prioridad, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, ¿cuál es el rol que ocupa la evidencia internacional? Mira, a mi modo de ver, hay dos cosas que son importantes de cómo traer la evidencia internacional a la discusión en el marco de este grupo local de educación. La primera es que, por supuesto, ¿no? Las acciones y las estrategias que se promuevan para poder alcanzar esa prioridad, pues tienen que estar fundamentadas sobre la base de la evidencia internacional que ya existe para asegurarse que así las acciones que se propongan realmente puedan lograr los resultados esperados, ¿no? Y en segundo lugar, también creemos que, por supuesto, la evidencia internacional y la evidencia nacional que se pueda generar para apoyar el trabajo de estos grupos locales de educación también puede subsanar las brechas de conocimiento que pueden existir, los vacíos de conocimiento que pueden existir en términos de esas acciones y de esa prioridad, ¿no? Entonces, para GPE es muy importante y nosotros hemos venido trabajando muy de cerca con el equipo de KIX, por ejemplo, en países como El Salvador, como en Honduras. Sería interesante, por ejemplo, que el ministro Esponda cuente un poco la experiencia del grupo local de educación en Honduras, o que Raúl también, si puedes comentar un poco la experiencia que ustedes han venido trayendo el grupo local de educación con los country supports que han hecho. Creo que son experiencias relevantes y que hemos venido trabajando realmente en conjunto para que no pase eso que también mencionaba el ministro Esponda, ¿no? Porque en el marco del grupo local local de educación justamente tienes a todos los actores bien liderados por el gobierno, y eso hace que realmente todos puedan contribuir, que haya un diálogo inclusivo, que se pueda conversar en torno a esas prioridades y que todos en conjunto definan esa agenda de investigación que va realmente a informar el alcance de esa prioridad, tanto llenando vacíos de investigación que pueden existir, vacíos de conocimiento que pueden existir, como también usando la evidencia internacional que ya está disponible. Entonces, bueno, sí, esa sería mi intervención, Javier. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Katherina, for stressing the point of the importance of channeling efforts towards priorities. And I think it's a long effort. I think, and again, based on the research, we see that it's not a usual thing to happen or to spontaneously happen in a region and in our countries, but definitely GPE is playing a key role in that, in trying to promote, let's say, a better coordination among actors, and definitely the global, the legs, the local education groups are playing a key role in that sphere. So I would like to, of course, turn to Donika. And Donika, I hope you speak English, because if not, I'm going to be the only one speaking English, although I'm Latin America, definitely. But just to be equitable with the language, although you could surprise me with your Spanish, maybe. But I think your experience is very interesting because, of course, you have from Jacob's Foundation, you're working in Africa, in Latin America, throughout different hemisphere in the world, but also you are working in Latin America, in Colombia, very importantly. So I think it will be interesting to see how, I mean, your perspective from a global, from a global position.
Great. Thank you so much, Javier, and sorry to disappoint. I'll attempt this in English. I won't try to do it in Spanish, but maybe next time, since we do, in fact, work in Colombia. But maybe let me just start with just a brief reflection and also building on what the others have said, which has been so helpful to hear your perspective. So first off, we're a global foundation, as you mentioned, Javier. We are working on getting evidence into policy and practice globally, but we do have a country focus: Colombia, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and our home country, Switzerland. When you asked me to think about what is an evidence ecosystem, actually prompted me to pull up an internal definition of what we mean by evidence ecosystem, since I do think that as a sector, we probably don't have kind of a shared understanding of what are we actually referring to. So what I'll share here is something internal, but of course, I'd love to hear what others think about whether or not we do need a shared definition as a sector. So what we talk about when we talk about evidence ecosystem is the interconnected system of actors and the processes and institutions and resources that constitute that ecosystem, which is both at a global level, but also at the national country level. And that goes from the very beginning of evidence generation, the translation of that evidence, the dissemination and the uptake of it within the policymaking process and within practice, because I think it's important to distinguish between policy and practice, which many others here on the panel have talked about. So it does encompass the full cycle of evidence production, and it looks at how to put that research and evidence into the hands of those that will put it into use within the policy process, but also at the classroom level. A second thing I wanted to note is that we've actually looked at, well, if that is the definition, are there well-functioning evidence ecosystems globally or at a national level? And how does the global relate to the local? And we identified a few characteristics which build on what you shared in the beginning, Javier, of what SUMMA has looked at as well. And I think they dovetail nicely. So for example, we looked at the effectiveness of how well evidence is embedded at all levels of policymaking, in the policy documents, in the reform process, in the very process of how governments actually draw down on evidence and demand that evidence. And what are the incentives that are put in place for civil servants to want to use evidence? Secondly, we talk about the collaboration between policymakers, researchers, and practitioners, both domestic production, such as Colombia, where you have a very high degree of research quality and a huge amount of evidence being produced locally, but also how do researchers interact with the global research agenda, and how do the two dovetail, and where do they actually differ? And we talk about knowledge brokers, those that are actually at the intersection of demand and supply. And are there examples of effective brokers around the world, which of course KIX and many other institutions have looked at, of how do we support those institutions to be able to be effective intermediaries of evidence between government decision makers, but also practitioners. And on that, I wanted to share kind of 3 quick reflections on both the definition and what we're seeing as the challenges in terms of these characteristics of high-performing systems. I wanted to leave you with one statistic. So recently, Nature has done a global survey of research to policy specialists and found that about 80% believe that their own systems are poor or patchy. And 70% said that governments are not routinely using evidence. Now, this goes beyond education. This is about all kinds of science advice, but it probably translates somewhere in the same percentages to education as well. And I wanted to say 3 things to that. One is, I think some of the challenges that we see is very much the disconnect between the global research production, but also the local research production, so the supply and the demand of what do policymakers and practitioners actually ask for, and what does research tell them? What questions are we asking, and how are those questions actually relevant? Secondly, I think you pointed this out at the beginning of the panel, Javier, the understanding and the work that we need to do to better unpack the messy reality of translation of research. I think we all agree that there's a lot of politics in policy making, but we don't often think about it enough. It seems we choose to either ignore it or to say, yes, it's there, but we're not actually going to account for that effectively. And I do think that that's a really big missed opportunity where we need to collectively look at the actual policymaking process from also researchers being able to understand that. And it was a very interesting quote in that same survey of how policymakers think that researchers are clueless about politics, and then researchers think that policymakers are clueless about research, which illustrates that divide that we have between the two camps. And then finally, I wanted to close with this notion of what is a knowledge broker and how do we actually build more evidence on the brokers themselves, which we've also not done very well. In fact, I think the latest statistic was only 6% of the existing brokering entities out there historically have done any evaluation of their own work, which is a stark statistic, given that their job is to do evidence for policy and practice. So we need to do a better job as a field in actually supporting those organizations to be better evidence translators themselves. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the next question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donika. And thank you again for underlying the importance of this issue of politics of policy reform. And I think we tend to feel uncomfortable talking about politics in this kind of spheres. And I think it's in any democratic country, we know that it is, of course, the way of channeling different preferences and different interest groups, etc. So it's legitimate to have politics in policy change, but we tend to put it in the corner there. Just to say that it is important, it's such an important issue that thanks to the support of GPE and within the KIX LAC Hub, we have started 2 months ago a study together between our hub and SUMMA or ECS with the OECD to join forces into a new report that will be serving around 10 countries and trying to characterize the political settlement and how this politics of policy reform works. So we will hopefully in a year, in around 18 months, we will be able to answer a little bit better the role of politics and the role of evidence and how to embed it within a political and democratical system. So it's a very exciting times. Thank you, Donika. So I will do the second round of questions. Of course, I will ask, because of time, maybe to try to respond very succinctly in 2 minutes. This next question that has to do with the challenges and opportunities that exist for fostering effective partnerships for education use among different actors. So what are the main opportunities that you see from your areas that we could leverage these different actors in order to strengthen the use of areas for policy reform and to improve education? So I think I will start again with Ministro Esponda. Ministro Esponda, could you please? ¿Sí?
Bien. No te prometo que sean tan escuetas porque la verdad es que el panel está muy interesante, pero a mí me parece súper oportuno lo que ha planteado Donika en la última disertación, es decir, cómo alineamos investigación con políticas públicas. Bueno, en la región están ocurriendo cosas interesantes, particularmente en El Salvador y en Honduras, digamos que los dos ministros que estamos, aunque desde luego que participamos del ruedo político, hemos estado involucrados toda nuestra vida en educación. Y precisamente esa es la clave del éxito, es decir, cómo las investigaciones científicas se convierten en políticas públicas sostenibles en el tiempo. En ese contexto, nosotros aquí en Honduras estamos impulsando el Plan 365 y desde la mesa y desde el grupo local y de la mesa de cooperantes estamos impulsando, por ejemplo, la firma del Pacto por la Educación. ¿Y qué es el Pacto por la Educación en Honduras? Pues sencillo, tener objetivos claros a corto, a mediano y a largo plazo, donde todos los actores políticos del país, sean de izquierda, de derecha, del centro, estemos de acuerdo y podamos avanzar. Porque uno de los problemas, pienso yo, y no me vayan a tomar a mal lo que voy a decir, ¿cierto? Pero si recogiéramos toda la plata de la colaboración que nos han dado a nosotros en Honduras y se la damos a cada escuela, de otro sistema educativo estaríamos hablando, ¿sí? Es decir, ¿cómo hacemos que los recursos de la cooperación y sobre todo los presupuestos que invierten los gobiernos se invierten en políticas que se sostengan en el tiempo? Para mí eso es lo más importante. Y por eso nosotros estamos trabajando fuertemente en el tema de medir la trayectoria del sistema educativo y no solamente de los aprendizajes. Es decir, cómo yo hago una valoración si el sistema educativo hondureño ha avanzado en el tiempo con esas políticas que establecimos. ¿En qué puntos y en qué aspectos debo de hacer ajustes? ¿Qué cosas debo de fortalecer porque nos está yendo muy bien? ¿Y qué cosas de las que investigamos o de las que pensamos que iban a ser exitosas, simple y sencillamente nos equivocamos? Porque esa es la otra cosa importante. Reconocer que nos vamos a equivocar y que esa equivocación nos debe de servir para construir algo mejor. Yo pienso dos cosas fundamentales para esto que acabo de plantear. Número uno es la colaboración entre pares. Es decir, cómo experiencias de éxito en pequeño las podemos trabajar con otros que no están teniendo éxito para que puedan alcanzar el éxito y validar si esa experiencia de éxito la podemos escalar. Porque tenemos millones de experiencias en el mundo, pero millones, donde dicen, no, en el pueblito tal, del municipio tal, de no sé qué país, tuvimos muchísimo éxito con esto. Sí, pero fueron condiciones muy, pero muy particulares. Si las experiencias de éxito no alcanzan el escalonamiento, entonces terminaron siendo eso, una micro experiencia de éxito. Y la segunda es la colaboración entre países. Es decir, a mí me encanta el GPI porque me siento tan cercano a los africanos, con casi los mismos problemas, quizás en diferentes frecuencias, que cuando después de las reuniones formales, donde nos damos la palabra de manera ceremoniosa, nos encontramos en los espacios más relajados y discutimos y hablamos de nuestros problemas y experiencias de otros países nos sirven para poder construir algunas estrategias de desarrollo. A mí me parece que eso es fundamental. La colaboración sur-sur es fundamental y que la podamos sostener en el tiempo y con esto voy a ir terminando, pero además de eso, ¿qué ocurre cuando los tomadores de decisiones dejamos de ser tomadores de decisiones? Porque a mí me parece que, sobre todo partiendo de que los ministros de educación en nuestra región no duran más de 1 año y medio, ¿no? ¿Qué ocurre con los ministros y las ministras que sí duran más tiempo o que sus políticas educativas se mantienen en el tiempo? Porque hemos encontrado ministros que duran poco, pero políticas que ellos definieron se han mantenido en el tiempo. ¿Cómo hacemos para aprender de esas experiencias y cómo las sostenemos en el tiempo? Es decir, cómo desde KIX, por ejemplo, que para nosotros ha sido nuestro tanque de pensamiento, sobre todo en las investigaciones que nosotros hemos hecho, cómo desde el GPI, desde KIX, desde los aliados, se puede construir también un tanque de pensamiento de la región para que no estemos reinvestigando lo que ya investigamos, para que no tropecemos en lo que ya tropezamos y que podamos impulsar, fomentar, garantizar, acompañar cosas que hemos hecho con éxito y que quizás a otros países no tienen que pasar lo doloroso que nosotros vivimos para tener una experiencia de éxito ya con estrategias más programadas. Pero todo ello respetando desde siempre la lógica interna de los países, la idiosincrasia del personal docente, y eso para mí es lo más importante. Es decir, cómo en todo esto que acabo de plantear ponemos como actores fundamentales a los niños y a las niñas en el salón de clase, pero comprendiendo que nada de eso puede transitar sin el concurso y el empoderamiento de los profesores y de las profesoras en los salones de clase. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, ministro. Laura, over to you.
Sí, gracias, Javier, y muy interesante, muy enriquecedor y interesante cómo vamos complementándonos, ¿no? Yo quería traer acá sobre la mesa el tema de que vivimos en una sociedad cada vez más digitalizada y en la que los datos están concentrándose en pocas plataformas de grandes corporaciones tecnológicas con poca transparencia de cómo se usan estos datos sensibles de personas de información, estudiantes, ¿no? Entonces, desde CLADE, para nosotros es fundamental pensar en cómo garantizar la soberanía de los datos nacionales, en cómo se producen datos desde los estados de acceso público, gratuito, abierto, que sea pertinente en el tiempo y amigable también para favorecer la gestión democrática de la educación y el control social de las políticas desde las escuelas, desde las secretarías locales, departamentales y hasta el nivel nacional, ¿no? Esta configuración nos parece muy importante. También creo que es fundamental valorar los saberes locales, como ya varios dijeron, en la producción de esta evidencia, contratar profesionales de los propios países que conocen la realidad local, no solo para enriquecer las políticas, pero también para evitar producción de sesgos en la producción de datos, ¿no? Y una producción de datos completamente descontextualizada. Entonces, es importante valorar ese conocimiento local. También pensar en la posibilidad de integrar sistemas que sean interoperables para facilitar esa articulación entre distintas políticas, sea de protección social, educación, salud, violencia. Entonces, ¿cómo hacemos esa vinculación entre políticas? También quería mencionar que estos datos no tienen que ser usados para generar rankings, competencia entre estudiantes, docentes, escuelas, entre redes, generar situaciones de premios y castigos. Más bien, la producción de datos debe servir de brújula para una creación de un ambiente de colaboración y compromiso con la realización del derecho humano a la educación de todas y todos. Finalmente, quería destacar que desde CLADE venimos aprendiendo en el marco de procesos KIX y también de educación en voz alta, que es otra iniciativa de GPE, que los procesos de acción, de investigación y acción participativa que involucran las comunidades educativas pueden generar datos cruciales sobre la situación de las comunidades que pueden ser escalados por los estados para enriquecer las políticas y que pueden también a la vez ser usados como valiosos procesos pedagógicos en las comunidades educativas. Entonces, consideramos que no, que los sistemas solo son eficientes y efectivos cuando todos tienen éxito, cuando se responde a la diversidad de cada actor de las comunidades educativas y, evidentemente, un elemento fundamental para esto es contar con los recursos necesarios, como mencionaba Javier al principio, para la implementación, desarrollo de investigaciones y producción de cambios a partir de estas investigaciones.
Obrigado, Laura. Y ahora nos vamos a Raúl.
Gracias, Javier, y a todos. Es realmente es un gusto escuchar que hay mucha sintonía también en cómo vamos asumiendo los desafíos. Probablemente destacar algunos de los elementos que se han señalado, como por ejemplo la articulación, la necesaria articulación entre los distintos apoyos e iniciativas que están ocurriendo desde la cooperación internacional, para efectivamente asegurarnos que estemos dando respuesta a prioridades muy concretas que los países tienen. Lo que señalaba también Donika respecto a la relación virtuosa entre política pública, práctica e investigación. ¿Cómo asegurarnos que esas preguntas de investigación sean coproducidas, co-creadas? ¿Cómo están esos espacios? ¿Cómo estamos asegurando esos espacios para que cualquier iniciativa de investigación aplicada que queremos que sea útil, por supuesto, responda y responda ojalá en los tiempos que tiene la política pública, que no son los mismos de la investigación de conocimiento básico? Destacar la importancia de lo que señalaba Laura recién sobre la necesidad de producir evidencia, datos, investigación, evaluaciones, y para eso, y ahí reforzar el punto de que para eso se requiere más inversión, definitivamente. Necesitamos desarrollar, fortalecer capacidades en nuestros países, en nuestra América Latina y Caribe, de tal manera que los equipos ministeriales de las propias organizaciones de sociedad civil, sindicatos y gremios puedan estar más fortalecidos en lo que significa investigar para aportar a la toma de decisiones. Ahí también estamos, y quisiera agregar dos desafíos que son muy relevantes desde el trabajo que hacemos en KIX. El primero es referido a la construcción. Es fundamental para nosotros la construcción de confianza entre los distintos actores e instituciones que conforman el ecosistema. Y la confianza obviamente tiene que ver en algún punto con lo que hemos conversado de la dimensión política, de la política pública. ¿En qué medida puedo confiar en otro que está en una posición distinta? Y efectivamente lo que intentamos impulsar es la generación de esos consensos que permitan que las distintas voces, perspectivas sean escuchadas. Eso es lo primero. O sea, hacer escuchar las voces que pueden ser distintas, pero que van en búsqueda de objetivos comunes. Y ese es un segundo punto que quisiéramos destacar respecto a no desviarnos del foco central, que son los aprendizajes integrales, el bienestar de nuestros niños y niñas en toda la región, el desarrollo físico, la motricidad socioemocional y fundamental, y por supuesto las habilidades y competencias fundamentales. La lectoescritura sabemos que es una habilidad fundamental para el desarrollo de cada niño y por supuesto para que aporte a nuestras sociedades. Entonces, el foco, por supuesto, tiene que estar ahí siempre, y eso es lo que estamos impulsando en todo lo que hacemos. Y ahí tomar lo que señalaba por último Katherina respecto a lo que nosotros consideramos también oportunidades de colaboración, involucrarnos directamente en el trabajo que se está haciendo al interior de los países, en los grupos locales de educación, como lo hemos venido realizando en el caso de El Salvador, por ejemplo, participando ahí en el grupo local y luego también en los procesos de apoyo directo en la incorporación de evidencia en los procesos de reforma. En Honduras, lo mismo, aportando a los intercambios de experiencia comparada y también informar de alguna manera las prioridades que el ministro estaba destacando. En el Caribe estamos haciendo algo parecido, aportando directamente y muy concretamente al desarrollo de estos SIGET, EMIS o sistemas de datos para la gestión educativa a través de la evidencia comparada y que también, por supuesto, se transforma en políticas públicas directamente. A la Universidad West Indies, en otra dimensión, lo que supone el desarrollo de la formación inicial docente como una dimensión clave del aporte de los docentes y las docentes en el mejoramiento de aprendizajes de los estudiantes. Eso en términos generales, invitamos entonces a una colaboración radical en ese sentido entre los distintos actores e instituciones que formamos parte de la discusión para el mejoramiento educativo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Raúl. Kate.
Sí, gracias, Javier. Déjame comenzar más bien por las oportunidades. Vamos a empezar primero más con lo positivo, ¿no? Yo creo que al menos esta plataforma que nosotros promovemos por el lado de GP, los grupos locales de educación, que tienen distintas formas en cada uno de los países en los que trabajamos, nosotros creemos que esos son realmente una oportunidad para que los distintos actores se puedan encontrar e interactuar con el gobierno. En muchos casos, nosotros recibimos feedback de las organizaciones nacionales, organizaciones de sociedad civil, etcétera, de que hay muy pocos espacios realmente de diálogo, de interacción. Entonces, los grupos locales de educación pueden llegar a cumplir esa función para que las organizaciones nacionales realmente puedan interactuar no solo con el ministro, sino también con el equipo del ministerio, por ejemplo. Y al revés también, ¿no? Es una oportunidad también para el equipo del ministerio para entender, para ver el sector desde los ojos de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, de la banca multilateral, de los actores internacionales, etcétera. Entonces, para nosotros, eso es realmente una oportunidad y hemos recibido como feedback de los participantes de los grupos que realmente es valioso para ellos. La otra oportunidad es que esos grupos no necesariamente tienen que ser perfectos, ¿no? Y en El Salvador y en Honduras, que son los países en los que yo trabajo más de cerca, empezaron esos grupos como grupos pequeños, ¿no? Y poco a poco se fueron ampliando, fueron incluyendo nuevos miembros, fueron identificando mejores procesos, fortaleciéndose, etcétera, y así van avanzando. Y para nosotros, por el lado de GP, lo importante es comenzar. Y justamente yo creo que que los grupos locales de educación y el hecho de que los participantes hagan vida y que sean realmente grupos interactivos y oportunidades de diálogo, justamente pueden contribuir realmente a la sostenibilidad de las acciones o de las intervenciones que se proponen allí. Porque cuando hay un cambio de administración o cuando hay un cambio de gestión, etcétera, los miembros del grupo local de educación se mantienen. Entonces, ellos tienen la oportunidad después de traer los aprendizajes que ya tienen, el historial que ya tienen, a la nueva conversación con el nuevo gobierno. Entonces, para mí esas son tres oportunidades clave que representan el trabajo de los grupos locales de educación a nivel de los países. Por supuesto, como bien ha resaltado, hay sin duda muchísimos desafíos y por supuesto que la integración verdadera de la generación y del uso de evidencia a nivel nacional, eso sigue siendo un desafío, pero creo que poco a poco, como bien dije, los grupos locales de educación no son perfectos y poco a poco se ha ido avanzando en eso, ¿no? Por ejemplo, en El Salvador, veo que está la colega del gobierno de El Salvador conectada también. En El Salvador, parte de la discusión es justamente cómo se puede ahora generar en el marco del grupo local de educación una agenda de investigación que realmente sea útil para informar la toma de decisiones y el avance hacia la implementación de la prioridad que se definió en ese grupo, ¿no? Entonces, sigue siendo un desafío, pero lo importante, yo creo, es seguir avanzando, seguir prosperando y que se sigan fortaleciendo, ¿no? Y es algo en lo que hemos venido trabajando en conjunto también con los colegas de KIX. Hay otros desafíos también, ¿no? Que van de la mano, el tema de la organización, que tú también mencionabas, pues, Javier, ¿no? En muchos casos los grupos locales de educación pues se vuelven grandes o la gobernanza de esos grupos puede ser complicada. Nosotros por el lado de GP, por supuesto, tratamos de prestar apoyo técnico, tenemos herramientas para hacerlo, pero siempre puede ser un desafío, ¿no? Y como bien dije, lo importante es seguir avanzando, seguir continuando, y hemos visto que sí hay crecimiento. De igual modo, con el tema de la definición de las prioridades y la capacidad que tienen los grupos locales de educación y los gobiernos para priorizar, ¿no? nosotros, bueno, todos trabajamos en educación, sabemos, el ministro Esponda lo sabe mejor que nadie, que es muy difícil realmente priorizar. Tenemos que, en el sector, pues queremos abarcar mucho, ¿no? Y eso es un reto que es importante, que nosotros hemos visto que los gobiernos y que los miembros de los grupos locales de educación enfrentan. Pero también hemos visto que hay mejoras. Y, por ejemplo, en el caso de Honduras y en el caso de El Salvador, al principio quizá la prioridad que ellos definieron no estaba completamente acotada, pero hay revisiones, hay diálogo, hay trabajo y se va avanzando hacia mejoras, ¿no? Entonces, eso es lo que yo creo que por el lado de GP nos gusta promover, ¿no? Que utilizar esa plataforma no es perfecta, pero sí se puede ir avanzando hacia el alcance de esos objetivos.
Thank you, Kate. And finally, Donika, please.
Yeah, I'll try to be very, very brief and pick up on a couple of things I've already been said. I think and maybe frame it more as where I see the opportunities, since we talked a lot about the challenges. One area where we're investing in is, as some of you are aware, is these education evidence labs or policy labs that are sitting at the intersection of the policymaking process and the research. And some of these entities are within government, embedded within the unit of government. In the Latin American region, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Menidu Lab in Peru, which was one of the original policy labs. Now, they all take different shapes and forms. And what we've tried to do is actually learn more about what is that function of a policy lab and bring more science into the brokering process and understand what kind of brokerage systems can we embed within the national evidence ecosystem to enable this process of evidence uptake to function better. And to take the example of Colombia, this is where it's actually taking the local level research agendas and the priorities of communities. And so it's a bottom-up approach, and then aggregating that up together with universities in different parts of the country to create a distributed education evidence lab that is very much a practice-oriented lab, looking at what kind of teaching and learning interventions are being implemented in different communities, and really attempting to answer the more practice-oriented questions that these implementation processes require. So that's a very different adaptation of a lab that you may have in other settings. For example, in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, these are embedded within a unit of ministry. So it's another way of thinking about how do we systematically support the ecosystem. But of course, the approach that you take will take into consideration the way that the system itself is organized. And where does decision-making actually happen? Who has influence? Who has decision-making authority? Who needs to be included? Do we have a research and learning agenda that we've co-created together, which I think is a really worthwhile effort of alignment of where do we align across the different entities, part of the ecosystem. It's not an easy process, of course, but it is a starting point, which would be my final point is I think we often think about kind of these as if there is a perfect end goal of a perfect evidence ecosystem. And of course, we're all on a journey. And what I think oftentimes we perhaps dismiss is the fact that we may need to think a little bit more systematically about what does that journey look like? Where are we at now? Where do we want to be? And how do we evolve together with the rest of the ecosystem or supported as stewards of that ecosystem so that we have a bit of a joint vision as to what are we trying to achieve together? What does good look like even? What do we want to see as how the different parts of the system connect? And how can funders such as ourselves at a global level most effectively support the ecosystem at a global level as well, so that the two are connected? We often use the kind of space shuttle example of the docking, where there is a mothership and then there is a docking system of how do we dock things together more effectively. And that's something that I think these kinds of processes and conversations can help us coordinate on better. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Donika, and to the rest of the panelists. It's been really a very rich panel, I think, and very important, powerful thoughts. I will not try to summarize them, but I'll do say 4 points just that I think highlight some of the things that have been said. One, the issue of priorities and the importance that these priorities are participative. And I think LEGS, the local education groups, play a key role. Second, the issue of research, the importance of research, but the importance that it comes from the Global South, shaped by Global South questions and methodologies and concerns, but in collaboration, of course, with the Global North. Three, collaboration, but a responsive collaboration in terms of link to the priorities and needs from policymakers. And fourth, impact. I would say that impact, and the minister said, was very clear in saying we have to go beyond piloting, beyond just doing an RCT and staying there. We need to really scale up, and going beyond scaling up, really into transformative perspectives. How do we transform education, which is one of course, the calls that UNESCO is doing to all our countries. Do you hear me? Sorry, someone said I was in mute. Yeah, sorry. So with that said, we'll open the question, the Q&A. Of course, we have a little bit less time that we thought, but I think it was wonderful, a wonderful panel, really. Yeah, very complex and deep thoughts. So let me see if I can see the hands, if any. I'm only seeing myself, and I've talked too much already. So maybe Ian can help me as well. I'm not seeing really. Okay, now I'm seeing the whole group. We are happy to take one or two questions from the audience. Please, this of course a round table in a way, and we're happy to hear your thoughts. I think it's a good moment. I see, of course, our dear Ana Najarro from El Salvador raising her hand. Please, Ana. Ana,
thank you.
Adelante.
Gracias, Javier. Es muy feliz de participar y poder compartir con ustedes el uso de evidencia para la toma de políticas públicas. Gracias al secretario Esponda de la República de Honduras, que manifiesta que estamos haciendo cosas interesantes y, por supuesto, para las políticas de largo plazo. Desde El Salvador, todo el equipo de monitoreo, seguimiento, muy de la mano para la toma el uso de evidencias, el uso de los datos, y trabajando con ustedes vamos a continuar por un 2025 de mayores coordinaciones. Gracias, saludos desde El Salvador. Hasta luego.
Gracias, Ana. Thank you so much, Ana, for that comment. Again, this is your space, your opportunity to make any question to the panel or any comment that you think it's of an important issue that has been left out, maybe, in this very important issue. If there are no questions, I will maybe make one question to the Minister of Education of Honduras, Daniel Esponda. I will give 10 more seconds.
Hello?
Oh, I see Sangdoma. Excuse me if I'm not pronouncing it right. Please go ahead.
Yeah. I have a questions for Mr. Daniel, sir, about the meals programs that is executed in his country. So I'm also representing one of the organizations named Calls Over Disaster Nepal, and we are also providing a meal program over since 2022, and we're right now benefiting lots of students, around 8,500 plus students. And my concern over here is is there any kind of when doing this program as or leading that program beyond the pilot programs, may I know some of the long-term goals or partnership modules or stakeholder contribution and management practices along with the opportunity and scalability of the scalability of the programs as well as return of investment. Because like mostly what happened is when we're like executing the programs or like, you know, pilot base, we put a lots of effort, we put a lots of resources. And when it is executed in a larger areas or like larger numbers, so, like benefiting a larger numbers, I think during a period, there is a problems for the organizations like who don't have the resources, not just financial, but in terms of like intellectual resources, in terms of like technical resources or like research and etc. So what is the like kind of combo, and then what is the kind of like management patterns that the country is following in terms of lunch? Because I do agree with Daniel sir about like meals is also the right of the children in terms of like, you know, working on the educations, because without consistency we can't work in quality education. So yeah, thank you for my question.
Ministro Esponda, do you want to reply? Yeah.
Bien. Bueno, contestándole a San, en primera instancia, recuerden que nuestro país todavía tenía las escuelas cerradas cuando yo asumí el ministerio en el año 2022, es decir, las escuelas estaban en educación remota. Partiendo de eso, también el país había perdido muchísima cobertura, digamos, en el tema de vacunación, que Honduras había venido siendo ejemplo en la región en el tema de vacunación infantil. El programa de alimentación escolar, en primera instancia, lo planteamos como eso, ¿no? Como la recuperación de la matrícula, pero sobre todo garantizar la permanencia de los estudiantes en el sistema. Digamos que esa es la discusión general del gobierno. Y aquí es donde viene un poco lo que nos decía la compañera, ¿no? Es decir, ¿qué es lo que deciden los tomadores de decisiones? Porque mi objetivo personal en el ministerio era construir una política de autonomía e independencia alimentaria. Es decir, el PMA nos está colaborando muchísimo en el tema de la alimentación escolar. Pero ojalá un día, y no lo tomen a mal lo que voy a decir, ojalá un día no ocupemos al PMA y podamos caminar solos. Ese es el gran objetivo que nosotros nos hemos planteado. En ese sentido, surgió otra necesidad, partiendo de nuestra investigación, digamos, ¿verdad? Y lógico, todavía está en construcción, es la necesidad de construir un modelo de educación rural donde nuestra matrícula en su mayoría está en el área rural. Entonces llegamos a algunas conclusiones. Nuestros niños están desnutridos por pura ignorancia, por ignorancia de las familias. ¿Cómo es posible que un país tropical donde podemos producir frutas y verduras todo el año, nuestros niños pasen hambre? Es por eso que, además del programa de entrega de raciones secas, que es lo que hacemos con el PMA, a través de construimos una red nacional de escuelas agrícolas y comenzamos a trabajar el tema de los huertos escolares, la productividad, las economías locales y las economías verdes. Eso estamos luchando por escalarlo y, por ejemplo, hoy ya no solamente es un tema de comida, generó en otra situación, que es el tema de las economías familiares. Tenemos grupos que están produciendo en terreno desde las escuelas, con nuestras escuelas de campo, que es que los muchachos y las muchachas de las escuelas agrícolas van a sembrar con sus papás y sus mamás y la están comercializando, estamos enseñando un modelo de negocio y pasamos de una caja de autoahorro a una caja rural, que la caja de autoahorro no está dentro de la legislación nacional, pero la caja rural sí, y pueden accesar a créditos. Y a hoy, al cierre del 2024, tenemos 6 cooperativas de estudiantes hechas por los estudiantes. Ellos son los dueños de los recursos. Entonces, en el fondo, nuestro programa tiene alrededor de 700 millones de lempiras, que si no me equivoco son como unos 28 millones de dólares. Pero en el fondo nosotros lo que estamos haciendo, o nuestra lucha, es por la construcción de un modelo de alimentación escolar sostenible, a tal grado que nuestra política desde la Secretaría de Educación de Autonomía Alimentaria, en las escuelas estamos haciendo investigaciones. Y maíz y frijoles es lo que nosotros más comemos en Honduras. Hoy tenemos 28 semillas criollas entre maíz y frijoles. Entonces, nuestra red de escuelas agrícolas ya se declaró enemiga de los transgénicos, de los agroquímicos, y estamos garantizando mantener nuestras semillas nativas. Entonces, por eso para mí es tan importante la colaboración sur-sur, los grupos focales y todas las experiencias que se puedan dar en otros países. Porque hay algunos caminos que nosotros íbamos a llevar en el tema de alimentación escolar que lo pudimos ver en Chile, por ejemplo, y ellos nos dijeron: en esto nos equivocamos, no lo hagan, o hagan su experiencia. Y nosotros de ahí tomamos algunas lecciones y por dicha no hicimos los errores que ellos hicieron. Entonces, en ese contexto, seguir investigando y que las investigaciones tributen a las políticas del país son fundamentales para cometer la menor cantidad de errores. Ahora, y con esto cierro la respuesta. Yo tuve un jefe que creo que es del que más he aprendido, que decía: cometan errores nuevos todos los días, porque en la medida que cometan errores nuevos todos los días van a aprender algo. Si siguen cometiendo los mismos errores, no van a ir a ninguna parte. Él lo decía con otras palabras muy latinas, ¿no? Pero para mí eso es lo más importante.
Muchas gracias, Ministro Esponda. Thank you very much to all panelists. And I'm being instructed that we need to move on. And I'm sure there's a lot of food for thought from this very rich panel. But I will give back the word to Ian, so we can take forward the rest of the seminar. Thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you so much, Ian.
Thank you, Javier, and a deep thanks to all of the panelists for the very profound insights. And I'm sorry that we have to move the discussion on. We were just getting some more questions coming through, so apologies for that. That being said, we will now move on to our second panel, our second moderated panel for today, on trust and reciprocity between researchers and policymakers. And I have the great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Professor Gita Steiner-Shamsi, who is the William H. Kilpatrick Professor of Comparative Education at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York. She also holds an honorary appointment as the UNESCO Chair of Comparative Education Policy at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. And she also serves as the lead researcher for the KIX EMAP Hub, which is the Europe, Middle East and North Africa, Asia and Pacific Hub. So with that, Gita will introduce our panelists and the session. So thank you so much, Gita. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ian. So KIX is definitely my favorite project. I really believe in the mission of increasing the use of research evidence and data, and I think KIX and GPE and IDRC together are doing an excellent job promoting that mission. It is my pleasure to introduce to you high caliber speakers that represent civil society, governments, foundations, but also knowledge producers in the form of civil society. And I will introduce them in a minute. Let me just quickly say three things on the topic of the second panel. The second panel is on how to establish trust and respect, mutual respect and usefulness for the use of research evidence and data for policy and planning, and also to analyze what are some of the factors that hinder that connection and that mutual relationship. There are three things I want to just say upfront. We did last year, 2 years ago, a global study for UNESCO on uptake of research and evidence, and it was in 5 languages. We had 1,000 respondents, and what it showed is that it is actually very limited. There is right now a surplus. We have so many scoping studies, toolkits, data, etc., as a result of the internet, of course, and the digital economy, but whether it's used or not, and when, and for what purposes, and what kind of data, I'm picking up of one of the comments from the last round, is a different question. So this is one of the things that we will be discussing today. A second point I wanted to point out is what KIX is doing. KIX is trying to bridge knowledge production and knowledge uptake for improving education systems. This activity of bridging these two communities is called knowledge brokerage, and it goes both ends. It means that researchers try harder to make their research communicable and useful and relevant, but it also goes the other way. that governments or decision makers ask for research and trust in research and believe in the usefulness of research. And this activity, there's a book coming out just this week. And some of the presenters, such as Donika, who was in the previous panel, produced a wonderful chapter. There's a book coming out on the topic of knowledge brokerage in global governance. And it's a book put out by NORAC, which is the organization that holds the hub for KIX EMAP. And the book is called Knowledge Brokerage in Global Governance in Education. And it's open access. It is published by Elgar Publishers. So this is self-promotion for today. And the last thing that I wanted to point out is that in this panel, I'm trying to make several rounds, not just 2 rounds, so that we can also interact among the panels. It's difficult to have a lively discussion online. So that means that I ask all the panelists to keep it very short, 2 minutes in the first round. And you should, rest assured there will be more than 2 rounds and there are more opportunities to share your experiences and your views. So without further ado, let me briefly introduce them in the order that they are listed, and you can see the more extensive bio notes in the program. But that's my big pleasure to introduce to you Marta Ekirapa. She's Deputy Director of Education and Kenya Primary Education Equity and Learning Project Coordinator. She's based at the Ministry of Education in Kenya. Then John Mugo, he is joining us under difficult circumstances. Among others, he had power cut issues. I hope it works out. We are very happy that he's doing his best to be with us. John is Executive Director of Zizi Afrique Foundation. Then the third panelist is Victoria Kisayaki. She is Manager of KIX Africa 19 Hub and also Senior Program Specialist at UNESCO ICBA. And then we have, as a fourth panelist, Esohe Egbike. She is Country Engagement Lead with GPE. And finally, we have our dear Dr. Andrew Cunningham. He is based in Geneva. He is Global Lead for Education at the Agarant Foundation, and he has a lot to say about this well-known project that the foundation runs. It's called Schools 2030. So let me give you the floor in the sequence in which you are listed. So the audience has the name in front of them when you speak. So please, Marta, the floor is yours. The question is, let me rephrase read the question. What are examples of strong connections between evidence producers and national policy decision makers? So basically a 2-minute input on one good example of where there was a bridge between researchers and uptake of research, a good experience that you have had. Please, Marta.
Thank you very much, Professor Gita. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I feel very much privileged to be among us, these distinguished panelists this afternoon, and for the rich discussion that has taken place. I want to say that as a policymaker sitting in the Ministry of Education, we have seen very close collaboration between researchers and policy makers, because you are all aware that research actually informs policy decisions. And for the education sector, therefore, which is actually a social sector, then it means we are the #1 takers of any research that is being done, because the education sector has a lot of challenges, and because of the diversity that is involved, because it is actually in every village, in every community across all nations, then it means we really must rely on very accurate evidence and research evidence, for that matter, to be able to inform us, come up with the right policy decisions. And I want to say right from the onset that education cannot wait. And it's therefore very, very critical for us to continuously undertake research that can be able to inform us to manage the education sector in the right manner. And it should not wait. If it has to be done now, then let it be done now. And I want to say that in Kenya, we are very privileged because we've undertaken and undertook a lot of research, policy recommendations that have really improved the learning outcomes in our educational institutions. For instance, early 2003, research informed that there was a lot of issues with access to education. And the research recommendations were very clear because it showed that because of the different diversities of the children in this particular country, there was need to cushion the children so that all of them can have access to education. And that is why the government of Kenya came up with the free primary education in 2003. And this was informed by research that really helped cushion quite a number of learners. And as we are speaking today, all our children are able to access free primary education. And the same happened again in 2007 when the government again declared to have free day secondary education, where again, we cushioned all the secondary school learners to be able to access quality basic education in secondary schools because the government was able to meet the full cost of the capitation for those particular learners. So in actual sense, this was a major policy shift in the education sector. And I want to say that according to the Executive Order number 1 of 2023, the Cabinet Secretary of the Ministry of Education is the one that has been vested with the responsibility of coming up with proper policy decisions that govern the education sector. And as such, it is really very critical for the ministry to collaborate with all researchers in the country to be able to help us come up with those informed policy decisions. And I want to cite one other example. And this particular example informed a research that was conducted under the GP-funded Primary Education Development Project that was implemented between 2014 and 2019. During that time, a study was conducted to be able to come up with means and ways of having equitable provision of capitation grants to schools. Because the capitation the government was providing for free primary education and free day secondary education was based on the enrollment of learners in those particular schools. But evidence showed that a school with low enrollment cannot be able to meet the necessary operational costs, like paying salaries for the workers, paying electricity bills, paying water bills, because it does not matter whether you have 2 learners or 2,000 learners in a school. There are certain basic operational costs that need to be paid. So according to that study on the equity-based financing model, the government of Kenya did not immediately implement the recommendations that were contained in the study. But I'm happy to report today that based on those recommendations from last year, the government was able to provide the uniform amount of money to schools to cater for the operational costs, on top of now the capitation that is pegged on the number of learners are contained in those particular schools. So I think in a nutshell, I feel very happy and very proud to have actually spearheaded that study that has really brought a big change in the management of education in this particular country. And today, as we are speaking, our principals of primary and secondary schools are happy because they can be able to make ends meet in terms of providing for the necessary operational costs in their schools. And
thank you so much.
I want to
so
stop
we move
there.
on, and then I give you another chance to. I mean, this was already very concrete.
Much, Professor. I want to stop there and give a chance to my next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we just heard from Martha how the government in Kenya uses research as a voice of authority to sometimes correct wrong decisions or give guidance for things, but also how to make concrete suggestions like the correction of per capita financing that we heard, or the abolition of tuition fees in 2003 for primary and then now for lower secondary. So these are really concrete, wonderful examples. Thank you so much, Martha. Let's go down with the list of participants with other great concrete examples how that bridge could work between research and policy decisions. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gita and Martha, who we work with closely. One of those people outside of government that have been generating evidence and looking for connections so that the evidence we have could inform decision-making and policy-making. In my third life now as a researcher, I started off as a researcher in the university at Kenyatta University, so as a university-based researcher. Then I went to my second life, which was working on citizen agencies. So using evidence to activate and animate, catalyze the public to take action and to hold government to account. And then I'm now in the third life as a researcher where I'm working on systems change. So having co-creating evidence with government for government-led government-led reform. So I'll be referring to these three lives on and off. But the two concrete examples I can give. One is WESO, the WESO learning assessment that we started conducting in 2009 was based on the premise that when citizens, parents especially, and teachers understand the problem, then we create demand for policy from the public. And so what happened was that when we were using very simple tools adapted from ASA in India, and assessing children based on grade 3, social literacy and numeracy. And the objective was to demonstrate that school was not working for a majority of children. And telling government that the narrative around input into education is not helping us. We have to focus on the outcomes, and especially learning outcomes. So the first report we released was in April 2010. And it led to us being summoned by the then leadership in the ministry to the accusation that we were spreading rumors that government was not doing its work. and it was, a boardroom full of, the PS, God bless him, the late Professor Karega Mutahi and others then, that we were not, they wanted to know about the methodology, about all this, about trigger, about tools, about the sample, everything, to discount the evidence that only around 27% of the children aged between 6 and 17 and 16 years could read a grade 2 level text. And we did the same for numeracy. And so what emerged then, we learned a lot about, rather than just doing this, opening the space and asking them, why don't you come with us to any place of your choice and assess children yourself? And so we saw transformation when we opened the evidence space to them for personal encounter. The second is in 2022, I was picked by an initiative led by the FCDO, Lehman Foundation and Central Lehman on South-South, and I liked the speaker who spoke about South-South. And I led a team from Kenya of government, decision makers in foundational learning to visit Sobral in the north of Brazil, and just witness how Brazil, the municipality of Sobral had approached reform using evidence. And after visiting schools and listening, one now champion from government, he was leading a county in Kenya, called us on the side as the Kenyan delegation and told us, I want you to support me that when we go back, we try this where I'm working. And that led to the establishment of a foundational learning initiative that they call now Napenda Kusoma, that is government-led, where they used the Sobral case. They were calling it Sobral in Kirinyaga is a county. And learning from there to just try things. And it was following the process of political adoption. So he spoke to all the politicians that came from that area for support, to teachers and all that. So so the last one is an initiative we call Education Evidence for Action, EE4A, where in 2015, we came together as evidence producers, but also policymakers in government, then the Directorate of Policy, and decided to establish this initiative where evidence users and producers sit together periodically to look at evidence that is emerging and apply that to policy decisions that need to be done. So rather than them against us, strengthening trust through this collaborative that we have had now since 2015, and we have convened 5 biennial conferences where we sit together, interrogate and apply evidence. Thanks, Gita.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. This was also very concrete. Let me give the floor to Esoha and then we get back to Victoria.
Good morning from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon, everyone on the panel and on this call. So I'm from GPE, and as we've been hearing in the previous panel, which was really interesting and relevant, how important evidence matters for us as GPE and is central to our operating model and how we work. The other thing, of course, that we would have heard is the importance of the inclusive local education group and this sense of mutual accountability across all the various partners involved in delivering and improving education systems and delivering education system transformation. I think that what I want to talk about, actually, there's a just when John was speaking just now, I was thinking there are those examples that we all have, in my case, from a previous life when I managed an education data research program, so pre-GPE, where you can see more clearly the short route between qualitative research, for example, being produced and policymakers being involved in setting up, in formulating the research question and the kind of direct short route to a very specific change. Similarly, on maybe a civil society organization doing very specific work on gender and social norms in a community, and then the short route to a decision being made. So we have those kinds of examples. But actually, I want to take this opportunity to maybe speak a bit more broadly about the system, because one of the things that I find really exciting about the way GPE is trying to work is that it's not so much just about the education sector, but really needing to think about the education system. My colleague earlier was talking about aligning various actors, and actually John was also mentioning this, and Martha as well. So I'm not going to talk about a specific example. I'm going to talk about an exciting opportunity that I think is emerging in Kenya, lots of Kenya examples. And I guess we'll have to cycle back and see how it goes. So what it is, just recently in October or so, we had a mission for the program that GPE is supporting in Kenya, which is the Kenya Primary Education Equity and Learning Program, which has government financing, World Bank financing, LEGO financing, and GPE financing. One of the aspects of that program that is, I mean, there are many things about this program, so I'll try not to talk about it in detail, but you would have heard Martha mentioned the work over time, the storyline in Kenya in terms of being able to access and transition. And one of the key interventions in this program is precisely to work with the most vulnerable children to ensure that they are able to transition. As a result, the program is supporting scholarships for marginalized children to enable them to transition, and is seeing lots of interesting and, you know, meeting its targets and having lots of interesting learning. Interestingly, also that's exciting, there's learning coming out of work that has been supported by a private sector foundation in Kenya that is essentially providing learning and technical assistance and consulting advice to the government of Kenya. through an agency, which is the Jomo Kenyatta Foundation, that is the government agency that's responsible for scholarships. Why I think this is interesting, and I'm kind of encouraging us to watch it, is because one of the things that is coming out of this is that from the learning about how this program is working, there's a kind of increased drive to say, okay, so what is the demand is, how should we as Kenya do proper scholarships? How should we operationalize and having a kind of minimum package of saying this is what works to help keep a marginalized girl in school, for example? What does that look like? What is the operation? How do we operationalize it? What is the, not just the package, but what is the mentoring? What is the cost effectiveness? And so government agencies are asking these questions as they look to actually systematize the work of this Jomo Kenyatta Foundation and try and have a new act set up to establish this new council, this new organization that will be managing scholarships across the country. So the other thing that I find exciting about this work is that there is the potential to bring in legislators. So as we know, in Kenya, we have constituency development funds, and we have legislators who are funding all manner of different ways of doing scholarships. So the evidence work coming out of this program, also supported by an NGO that will be working on helping the Jomo Kenyatta Foundation formulate the research question, the potential to be able to influence essentially what legislators are doing is quite important if we think about efficiency of education spend more broadly. So it's not just what the education system is doing or what GPE funds are supporting, but how can we use evidence in this case, hopefully over time, to be able to go to legislators and say, okay, this is how you've been doing scholarships, you know, based on the evidence, this is another way you could be doing scholarships. And how can we use evidence to try and align all these various actors beyond the Ministry of Education to come together to have a more kind of evidence-based approach to doing scholarships that is coherent across the country. So this example is, for me, quite exciting if it pans out, in terms of the opportunities for evidence producers. In this case, there's an NGO and researchers and the Jomo Kenyatta Foundation formulating research questions. How do we use that and those connections of the people that will be producing the evidence to try to link to national policymakers? Obviously, the foundation itself and the Ministry of Education, but beyond that, to also to legislators and to kind of being able to use evidence to stimulate conversations in Parliament. I think it's an interesting potential case study. So I'm not quite answering the question, but just talking about
it was great,
interesting things.
It was very good example of cross-sectoral or using research also for networking beyond one sector and having a systemic impact. I know that John and Martha have connection issues, so they're trying their best to have the cameras on, but forgive us if they can. But let me get back to Victoria.
Thank you very much. I'll speak in line with the UNESCO's work and the KIX Africa 19 Hub concerning our experiences. One of the interesting examples that we have, it has been about the development of evidence-based teacher policies, where governments have been requesting for evidence to UNESCO, like to be supported to generate evidence to improve their national teacher policies. And we at UNESCO, we have what we call a guide that we use to build the capacity of teams within the ministries of education to help them generate evidence that is relevant to their needs. And because it's a demand-driven process, and we also want to foster ownership, so the first thing we do is about capacity development in terms of getting the right research and also using the right evidence so that eventually it informs or improves the design of policies. And we've done that for Zambia, we've done that for Uganda, and recently within the KIX Africa 19 Hub, Ethiopia asked for support through the KIX Africa 19 Hub in terms of how best they can generate a good research report to help them strengthen the teaching profession as per one of the programs that GPE is funding. And so we took the same approach where we began with capacity building of the technical officers within the Ministry of Education so that they understand the key dimensions and elements that they need to be able to get the right research that is needed to improve their own teacher policy as well as the accompanying frameworks. So there are several dimensions, let's say, on teacher recruitment, teacher retention, on capacity development, evaluating the teacher education curriculum, and so on and so forth. And so if you do not build their capacity, they will generate evidence, but that is not usable. So from our perspective, let me switch off my video. So from our perspective, we endeavor to make sure that we strengthen their capacity first so that they can be able to generate the right research that will inform the design.
Fine. Thanks so much, Victoria. It's a little bit difficult for us to hear, but I think we got the point that you are first doing capacity building with governments. I'm just briefly repeating, and to ensure that the kind of research that researchers produce, the kind of data they draw on are useful and are trustworthy by the governments. And you brought the example of Zambia. So hopefully it will be fixed so you can also actively participate in the second round. But let me give the floor to Andrew Cunningham. Andrew, please.
Thank you, Gita, and thank you, GP and IDRC for this 5th Annual Knowledge and Innovation Exchange Symposium. And a big thank you to Martha, John, Asohe, and Victoria for the comments that really make it easy to be the last panelist on the first question. And I really want to concentrate on that aspect of how do we actually build the connections that really foster the trust and reciprocity that is needed to connect the evidence producers and those that are actually at the forefront of impact. I want to give just 2 kind of initial thoughts to this question. And the first is, how might we, as a global education community, and I see all 240 participants around the world in this conversation, so I'm looking and I'm sort of hoping that we can respond to this question, but how could we see teachers as our R&D partners of choice? So how might we see teachers as the research and development partners of choice? And what I mean by that is, are we inviting teachers to not only provide feedback, but to be in a position to feed forward about what we could be doing better and how we could be aligning with what Martha and also the minister from Honduras mentioned this morning, translating the problems and challenges that government teachers are facing every day into the meaningful questions that researchers and teachers themselves can have smaller, quicker, easier feedback loops in order to realize this larger ambition of teachers as a profession that has agency, that teachers are leaders in the research and evidence sector. And we've seen this over the last 5 years of the Schools 2030 program. We're halfway in a 10-year program, and we really see different ways of how we can best support teachers to assess in their classrooms, working with psychometrically validated tools, not only on literacy and numeracy, but also on social emotional learning domains. We've seen how best to support teachers as the design thinkers. How do we actually not only adopt and adapt innovations and the models, but how do we iterate moving forward? Again, giving the next 6 months, perhaps after a proven model, of what could work in the next grade level. And third, we've also seen how best to support teachers to also showcase these journeys of evidence. So one hope that we have in teachers as the R&D partners of choice is, imagine in each country 10 proven models that our respective organizations, ministries, research organizations say, this will work. to address the learning needs of our children? Could we work with a group of teachers in each one of these countries in a 3-month, 6-month, 10-month cycle to get that feedback of what is working, what is not? And that leads me then to the second point and final one is impatience steals and patience rewards. Imagine having a newborn next year. I'm very excited. One of my best friends is having a child. Imagine the baby turning 5 years old in 2030, 10 years old in 2035, 15 in 2040, and becoming a member of society in 2050. How many of our research questions and our policy-making decisions are taking a generational approach? Those questions and evidence that will outlive us, our project, our political cycles, and potentially even our organizations. And so there are kind of 3 big questions underneath that perhaps could spark some conversation. I'll leave those with you. How might teachers become the most important green job on which all future green jobs will depend? That might require different research combinations that's outside of the education sector. How might teachers be the best navigators about how to best explore the benefits of AI and technology? Are we engaging the technology sector in ways that are rooted in learning results? And finally, this question of 7 out of 10 learners who cannot read or understand a simple text. How might we greater understand the role of learning differences, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, in perhaps understanding maybe these children could read if their learning differences were addressed? And in particular, how might also the language of instruction and assessment also provide a greater sense of inclusion? So those are some initial questions into this really important topic. But I think in answering those questions with teachers at the center, whether through Schools 2030, whether through many other organizations represented on this call today, I think that's how you build and you foster trust and reciprocity who needs it most.
So this is really wonderful, Andrew. It really expands the way we talk about research. We always talk as if researcher would be researchers, professional researchers, rather than also action researchers, teachers. And it also expands our vision that data and evidence is used for policy and planning. And you talk about policy planning and practice at the classroom level. So I think every speaker had really wonderful things to add to each other. And we have a whole list of how trust and connection could be strengthened, starting with Martha's 3 great points about how we can mobilize resources. She used education cannot wait as as a term, not as a name, but as a term, but also research for resource mobilization, but also for correcting as a source of authority to correct previous wrong decisions, but also as a guidance. That's the 3rd one. Then John's point about strengthening citizenship engagement and social accountability. That's a term that the World Bank is now using with CESA, citizenship engagement and civic and social accountability as a way to help set agendas, political agendas, policy agendas. So education for agenda setting was the 4th point. Then the points about transnational collaboration or network collaboration. Both Victoria talked about it, Soha talked about it, how to work across government, not only Ministry of Education, but also across countries with peer exchange and peer learning. And finally, as I said, Andrew's point about going down, trickle down research to the classroom level to those that day-to-day are in the business of doing education. So these were wonderful examples. Let me move on to the second question, which deals about factors that hinder or help foster relationships of trust and reciprocities. Just maybe one level of abstraction, just thinking back of all these wonderful examples that you brought, what was the turning point? What was the ingredient that was needed to make this relationship work? Anyone can start. please. Maybe we should give the floor to Victoria because she was a bit short because of technical issues. What is the key ingredient? You talked about capacity building, except apart from capacity building, what, in your opinion, is the key point that KIX 19, for example, is using to ensure that there's an uptake of research?
Yeah, one of the things that we have learned is using the available communication channels as well as the packaging of the research for us is very critical. Because yes, there will be a lot of research out there that is being done, but if you don't utilize the communication channels and platforms to disseminate it to the different types of stakeholders, then it's very difficult for them to use it. And from my experience, as we've interacted with the Ministry of Education focal points and other government technical experts, the research must be broken down into simple messages that are translatable into practice. Because researchers, and probably myself, I'm also guilty of this, we are very prone to producing high-pitched end reports that are full of very high-pitched language that is not translatable to most of our technical officers in the government sector. So once you produce a report that is not understandable, that is not translatable, doesn't have policy briefs and so on and so forth, it will be good, but it will be put on the shelf and abandoned. So we try to create that space at the KIX Africa 19 Hub where we engage the stakeholders vis-a-vis policymakers and researchers and the government technical experts to just communicate in a language that is understandable so that they can be able to utilize that research. For us, that's very, very critical. Thank you very
Wonderful.
much.
Any other thoughts? I see John is making a movement towards the... Please, John.
Yes, yeah, I can highlight three things that we have learned. One is scale, that government doesn't make decisions based on just one place or to favor just a region. So whatever evidence we produce, it would have to also demonstrate how, it would apply everywhere. The second thing is around convergence with political interests. Previously, I hardly paid attention myself to like what the party manifestos, are and what the president promised to the people when he was elected. Those things for me as a researcher were not important. For me, what was important is what works and what I know we have had evidence on. And yet politicians are working on promises and thinking about the next election. So how do we have our evidence speak? Then the third is engagement. So rather than producing evidence and going to decision makers, having them as part of even conceptualizing the research process, because I think somebody said, we as researchers, we think government, people in government have no capacity and the other way around. So how do we have a collegial, co-creation approach so that they are part of even informing the design, the tools and all that, and being part of even the research process, and then formats. And Victoria has spoken to this. I spent a lot of time writing very, brilliant policy briefs, publications, good reports. And somebody told me, John, by 6 a.m., the ministers and all that have read all the newspapers. And so if you want them to pay attention to anything, then maybe a newspaper article rather than a policy brief might be an easier way of getting them to read and pay attention. But then as a researcher, we would look down on things, like newspaper articles, and yet social media, X and all that is what they may pay attention to. And lastly is about, no, let me leave that to the next person. Thank you.
That was great, actually. Anyone? Please, Esohe.
Yeah, John, it's like you stole the words out of my mouth. I was nodding here as I looked at what I scribbled, but you said your point so much better than I was going to. I think this question for me is is an interesting one because it kind of makes you think back on your career and, you think back about some of the things that you did. And I think we're all giving those reflections here. I think that, you know, in that this question also links to some of the things that were discussed in the previous panel. So I think it was our colleague from Honduras that was saying, you know, like what's the demand and what's the research question and what matters to us, which is your point about demand. And, you know, somebody also said in the previous session that we don't really like to talk about politics, but we have to talk about politics. And I think John's point has said that, because if there's no interest in the question, and if there's no demand, and if nobody considers it a priority, then we could be there kind of fluffing around talking about research all day, and then nobody's actually that interested. So I think ensuring demand and interest is really important, I would say. The other thing is around this whole point about who sets the research question. I think it's a critical one, and there's so much work on this. I think a colleague talked about a Nature article earlier from the other panel. This is something that I look back on, to be quite frank, in terms of other work I've done in my life, and like, you know, being in different spaces, you know, worked as a donor, worked as here, and, you know, who was setting that research question? And I think there is a role, thinking about all the different actors within the local education groups that we work with as GPE and encourage. I think we have to kind of call a spade, or look at ourselves and think about the way we set different groups, whether it's civil society or donors, how we set the research question, who is setting the research question, and to what extent we are deliberately, as someone else said, building capacity of national institutions and local, building local capacity. Not just in setting the research question, but in every single stage of the research. And I don't think we do this very well. I feel quite strongly about this because I have my own regrets. And, you know, I was reading actually just last week, policymaker at a subnational level in a country in Africa, just saying that, you know, him reflecting and saying, if only donors, for example, in this case, could take all the money and effort that they spend doing all sorts of research on the side and kind of support us, what would the world look like? So I think that's the business of how we go about setting the research question, working with partners on the ground, I think is an ongoing challenge. And maybe we should assess ourselves and have like a spectrum of to what extent are we making progress on this issue and essentially track it. The other thing I think points to Andy's question, which is Andy's example around teachers, which is wonderful. You know, sometimes we sit in these panels and we don't have a teacher present, for example, many of the time. And I think that there is a question around what is rigor and what is research and what is evidence. And I think that is a central question in the business of what we're doing, because we've heard our colleagues who are researchers say that. And to what extent do we have the space in this community to say different types of evidence generation constitutes good enough evidence? And this is you know, do we have a collective understanding of what minimum standards of rigor look like? So I think getting to that will help in terms of building trust and reciprocity. I think you're trying to stop me, so let me stop. I get quite sentimental.
That was great. That was very good. Let me give the chance to Martha and Andy. Andy, your comments triggered a lot of good reactions. Martha, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I really want to, I was smiling when Andrew was speaking, because you can come up with a very good curriculum. But if you don't take care of the teachers who are going to implement that curriculum, then you're doing nothing. And I want to say, I totally agree with what Andrew is saying. And could be for us to have good uptake of this research. Could be we can focus on what the need mainly is. Like in this particular case, can we purpose as educationists, can we purpose to do research that is affecting the teaching and learning in the classroom? Anything that is affecting that teaching environment should be looked into, so that our researchers in the house, like Dr. Mugo, should be focusing every time and finding out what is really happening in the classroom. And I want to also concur with Dr. that it is true, in the early 2010, the learning outcomes in our schools were quite low. But today it's a different thing. It's a different story, because as much as we try to bury our heads in the sand, we had you, and we put measures in place. So I want to challenge all of us. Let us come up with that research topic that you think is really affecting the community, affecting the stakeholders. It will make the recommendations to be implemented immediately with no question about it. And I think it's also important for us as researchers to really team up with the policymakers so that even after coming up with our research recommendations and with the findings, we should look for a better way of disseminating it, because when it comes to education sector, it is in every village. I remember sometimes back, we decided to conduct quality education dialogues in every county. And we could single out the specific issues that are affecting learning in that particular county for that county. And we could even go and speak in vernacular. And it was quite impactful. So what am I saying? That if we can bring ourselves down to the level of the communities and really go and hammer the point home, then it means we shall all be speaking from the same language and reaching out to the right people we really want to reach to. And I think if we can be able to do that, then the researchers and the policymakers can really read from the same script. Let me stop there for now.
That was a great point. So Andrew, you have the last floor, and then we open up for discussion.
Thank you, Geeta, and thank you, Martha. I could not articulate that better, and if there's a sound bite going out after this seminar, I really hope it's yours. And no disrespect to the other panelists or everyone, but I think this orientation towards the profession that is already at scale, which is teaching, is one of our greatest resources that are also underutilized the most in research and policy development. And I think that lends itself to one concrete example where we have seen this co-creation of a research agenda and also the prioritization by teachers and the Ministry of Education in Tanzania at this common question now on all government minds about greening education, climate and education. It's a high political commitment, and rightfully so, in all countries, not GP eligible countries, but all countries. And the Tanzanian Ministry of Education had already developed 8 climate actions that they, through research and evidence, would recommend for uptake in schools. Use of biogas, use of solar energy, school waste management, rainwater harvesting, beekeeping, planting and care of trees, garden establishment, and participation in social activities related to the environment. So what did we need to do research on? Teachers wanted to know, how could we use these actions as pedagogical approaches for also improving inclusive learning environments and quality learning outcomes? So let's zoom down into one of those climate actions, planting of trees. How do we think about the trees in a microforest? So that's a group of trees, it's a diverse set of seedlings, but think about it now in 4 dimensions. Okay, my kids are consistently struggling to read and demonstrate extremely low levels of motivation to learn. How do I use tree planting and microforests as a new teaching and learning resource? Second, in terms of pedagogical approach, I'm having significant trouble managing my incredibly large class size every day with 90 to 110 learners. How does an outdoor space also complement an indoor space for teaching and learning? Third, for gender inclusion, I'm noticing actually that my boys are not engaging as much as my girls in my lessons. How does a work with nature perhaps also spark a more or a higher engagement by both girls and boys in my classroom? And fourth, I see that my students are suffering from the ever-increasing heat each day. How might an understanding of working with the microforest yield that it's not a mystery of where these challenges are coming from? And so one of this is really exciting is that FCDO, USAID has supported Schools 2030 Tanzania to actually work with teachers for a year to understand how this kind of climate action, but the other climate actions, are what education researchers and what teachers are really good at. How does that affect my pedagogy? And so I think it's also keeping what Martha said is a deep focus on what is the profound opportunity of education research. And that really is the connection with how do we take all these different new innovations, all these different terms, and help the future of pedagogy moving forward. And so we're looking forward to that being an example for us at the Aga Khan Foundation, but other Schools 2030 countries and other partners, particularly as GPE in last week's board decision has also committed to advancing climate in education, but also alongside exploring how teachers can be critical contributors to educational reform. I think that's the intersection where we see a very exciting frontier of, frankly, shared power, shared potential, and shared impact.
Thanks so much. You know, Andrew, I don't know if you read that, but someone talked about how your approach as trickle up and trickle down. That research should have an impact at the classroom level, but also come from practitioners up. We have a couple of questions, and I also would like to add my own, and mine is a little bit provocative, so we have an interesting discussion. Mine is, do you think we will ever see the day that governments from their own money commission research, not from donor money, own money, believe in research, they want to get more guidance? What would it take for the government to commission research? And do you think we see the day that as part, it used to be that we would put 5% for M&E or MEL. Do you think we see the day that the government would put 5% or 10% for research, for guidance in any budget that they have in order to get guidance, whether it's at the policy level, at the planning level, or at the pedagogical level? These were my two provocative questions for you to discuss, but we also have questions from the chat room. So let me go into the chat room. Anyone who wants to say something in person should first say it in the chat, so others that already placed their questions are taken first. There was a point about the right timing. I think, John, you put that very nicely, that, you know, what governments promise when they come in or before they go out. There was also talk about co-production, and many of you talked about the importance of co-production. And actually, we think KIX EMAP, Europe, Northern Africa, Asia Pacific, that we are actually, that's one of the, I would say, characteristics or features of the way that hub is functioning, of bringing researchers and decision makers together to produce. So the co-production, both global and local, but also researchers and governments together and practitioners, is a feature that some hubs have. But let me take a few comments. There was one question for you, Andrew, what about the principals and leaders? What is their role, and can they be involved in this level, classroom level or school room level research? Maybe you can take this, and then meanwhile, Ian, if you see some questions, please help me identify them so we can ask them. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much for the questions and also the provocations, Gita. Let me take maybe just a 1 minute and see what I can say in 1 minute and then pass it to my colleagues. One very easy answer, yes, for school leadership. Every piece of research points to the inclusion of the school community and shared leadership, distributed leadership, and really engaging in that collective unit as a school and a learning community, which also extends beyond the classroom. So a big yes with an exclamation point. I think second, related to your question, Gita, around investing, in research and the government making investments. This is what I see in the budgets and support already being spent in teacher salaries and already being spent in professional development. I think this is a very powerful budget item and investment that action research seems to take a third place, or qualitative feedback takes a fourth place. And I think the place for teacher, again, feed forward, more agile, more light touch feedback loops is something that we have really never seen the dividend yet, because we haven't made a new rhythm that goes beyond a baseline, end line, a political cycle, but more about, I'm going to work with a group of kids in the same school, perhaps for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. I'd like to be part of an iterative cycle rather than a linear one that is in partnership with the investments that the government is making. So that would be my first reflection, and my minute is up. So passing over to
Okay, so let me just pick from the chats that we had and call on them if they are able to turn on the video and themselves. One is from Maria Brindelmeyer. You had a interesting specific comment and question, and also afterwards, let me get the floor to Anis. But Maria, you go ahead, and then I'll also pass the floor.
Sure, thank you. So I think my comment was that it's really important that we think about who the evidence is for when we are generating it, and also especially when we are presenting the evidence, that it's really focused on the target audience, and then also that we shouldn't just think, and I think several of the speakers have mentioned that, shouldn't just think about one or two methods of research when we are thinking about proving what works. It has to be, I think, a mix of different methods, including the action research, including implementation research, so that we really know how something can work in a specific context. I think that's important, and also touches on a comment that somebody else had made about transferability of evidence from one country to another. And I think John Mugo made a good example about transferring the experience from Brazil into Kenya, and it required a lot of that involvement of the government in that. So more comments rather than questions, but supporting, love the panel. Thank you.
Does anyone want to pick up? There is another question that maybe it is connected by Cheryl Joseph on replication and scaling across. It's directly related to the topic of this panel on trust. How can, when researchers make recommendation on how to scale innovation or how to disseminate it, how can they make sure that they are believed? As simple as that. What helps to generate credibility or legitimacy for research findings? I know that one of the colleagues from Pakistan who is in the KIX EMAP hub, Sajid Ali, says sometimes it helps, which is funny actually for us to see that as a Pakistani, for him, it's sometimes it gets more legitimacy if he says it is internationally funded. Even though he is an Oxford graduate, he's a professor at Aga Khan University, actually, in Pakistan. But he says that international label helps. The question is it sometimes also the opposite, that the international level hinders? Do you have experience where it hinders and when it helps? Just very concrete. But this is a good question from Cheryl Joseph on, we make a lot of recommendations, even we communicate them well, even we write op-ed pieces, even we do social media. It doesn't mean that it's picked up and believed, what we say. So any thoughts on that?
Can I come in?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah. So yes, from my experience, there is an incident that we had in Zambia. And it was quite an interesting one, where one of the international institutions commenced a research on teacher aspects. But because the government folks were not part of the process, it was a beautiful report that was produced, but it was put on the shelf. The government refused to use it. And then secondly, they say the data in that research report is not from our MS system. It does not represent what our MS systems are talking about. And so there are two things that I picked from that process, that yes, it's good to be supported from the international community, but also if it's a collaborative effort with the government involved, and also using the locally generated kind of data, it brings that sense of ownership, so that at least it can foster or diminish the biases that we're talking about before. Yeah, so that's my point in terms of limiting the biases. I hope I'm clear. I'm sorry about the network connections.
Any other, just to let you know, we have 10 more minutes for discussion. Maybe on that point. I saw, John, you wanted to talk about, is it good or bad to have international funding in order to be heard?
I think it's important to have both. Both are important. And in my opinion, they should be used, together. For Kenya, what I know is that there's a lot of now esteem and agency that we have what it takes to develop ourselves. And so there's a lot of not resistance, but care, that is exercised when you say we are borrowing something from outside. And so both context and the international focus are seen as important. And a lot of our research now is also grounded, for this ground up, because many contexts, it's not just a question of what works, but also the question of how, where, and when. As important perspectives. But Gita, I don't know whether you also saw a question that I thought was very instrumental about the constant shifts and changes in government. When transfers, happens, somebody asked that. I'm not able to read very well because I'm connecting on my mobile phone. But the question that Andy raised around teachers and the ground, I think all the 4 or 5 levels, from the politician who will pass legislation all the way down to the teacher and parents, and then the middle, we are implementing a KIX-funded initiative called the Unlocking Data Initiative with Education Sub-Saharan Africa, with eBase, University of Malawi, and EdTech Hub. And what we are trying is to unlock the various levels. So rather than just saying the top or the ground, so it's never an either or. It's about having an engagement that takes care of all the levels. Then we may see movement. Because also action research itself will need to be supported by the middle, and it will have to speak to the top for those decisions to be made. And yet the top is not adequate, because ultimately it will have to be the teacher or the parent doing something with the child. So I think this holistic or systems approach is what safeguards these transfers, because you're not dealing with the person, you're dealing with the system and the entire ecosystem, and having evidence target the various levels. Thank you.
Great point. Martha, you're always very powerful. What do you have to say? Anything you want to say here? So we can cite you afterwards.
I had left my mic unmuted for a long time. I hope I was not disturbing the panelists.
Don't worry.
So I was saying that I think it's really important for us to work right from the onset, even with the stakeholders, instead of the researchers doing it on their own and then just coming back with now the report and the recommendations. Because it will be important even to get the views of the stakeholders of what really need to be researched on. I have an example where I've been managing projects, and we've been getting consultancy services from our university lecturers and firms where they come and sit with us and we tell them this is what we want. Get for us data on A, B, C, D, and like just preparing a terms of reference and giving, the researchers and telling them now go and do that. It's really good to have a sitting so that even at every stage of the research, I think there should be some briefings so that you are moving at the same pace, so that you don't just wait until the last minute and you get a rude shock of what the findings are all about. Because I also had an instance where the Teacher Service Commission had wanted a research done on the staffing norms. But unfortunately, they left the farm to continue up to the very tail end. Then at the end, they could not uptake the research findings. So it was very unfortunate because we realized later on the Teacher Service Commission still to a large extent implemented some of the recommendations, but they said we don't agree with these study findings. And yet to a large extent, even when you look at what has happened now in terms of the staffing norms, they have largely implemented the recommendations of that study. So I think we learned a big lesson that it's always good to work, with the research firms or with the consultants in question so that we are moving at the same pace.
This is, I think, a very good last word from Warta. We should end here. There is a few more comments. Also, Maria Brindlemeyer brought up that the government should be encouraged to have local research labs. And I think this is what actually KIX is all about. KIX supports local research labs, and it supports it in different ways. Each of the hubs does it differently, but this is what the whole ambition is of KIX, and I think KIX did a good job so far with doing that. There were a couple of points about, Kenya is a brilliant example, and that's probably also why Martha was invited to talk about the experiences in Kenya of having the government say what research is needed. So it is really demand-driven, and the government says, and commissions even research on questions that are important to them. But I think I have to pass the floor back to Ian in 2 minutes, but I still want to summarize this. I summarized the first part on the 6 different points that were made. On the second one, on what some of the barriers are, there were also really great points made. And let me just say a few of them about talking the importance of having actionable or translatable research, the importance that government is not interested on just pilot project, but on scale, on big thinking. And let me just add that I think we are a little bit spoiled in the last 15 years. Most research that were funded by donors, by big donors, I'm not going to say any names, were impact evaluations. And maybe we have to move away from impact evaluations and see research broader, and also as implementation research, and broader as like inquiry-driven research on specific policy, on specific questions, and not just impact evaluations. The question of timing, that's a third point. That's John made that beautifully about convergence with political agenda. There needs to be a window of opportunity that we can seize to have an impact, to give answers to questions that are relevant in the local context. Then a point that many of you did is on co-production, not just at the end that we present the data to the government or to decision makers or to schools, but from the beginning, the practitioners, the policymaker, the decision makers have to be part of the project. From the moment where we ask what the question is, the research question, to how we design, and then how to disseminate. At each stage, they should be involved. And so these were some of the points that were made, but I think I should give the floor back to Ian then, and also for a few closing comments that we have at the end of this panel. Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gita. Thank you to all of the panelists for genuinely some very deep insights on relationships of trust and reciprocity. Your work is truly phenomenal and outstanding. So a deep thanks to that. I have the pleasure now of passing over to Nasser Furukui, who is with the International Development Research Center. He is Director for Education and Science, to offer a few closing remarks on today's part one of the annual symposium. We will reconvene tomorrow at 7 a.m. EST for day two, which will be focused on KIX projects with a number of different partners, both researchers and government end users. So strongly encourage you to join for the second part of the KIX Symposium. But with that, and again, my genuine thanks to all of the panelists and moderators for today, let me pass straight over to Nasser for a few closing remarks and to close us out for today. Nasser, over to you. Many thanks.
Thanks so much, Ian. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
What a fantastic discussion. I really want to thank all the panelists and the participants for sharing your insights, your experiences, talking about the critical role of evidence ecosystems in fostering connections between evidence producers and decision makers. Gita did a nice sort of summary there at the end. I have some points as well just to reinforce. I mean, we talked about cultures of evidence, delved into enablers and bottlenecks of evidence uptake, and this really provides valuable insights for GPE, KIX, and other initiatives to strengthen evidence use. Collaborative contextual research. So many, including the minister from Honduras, emphasize the need for research that is collaborative, context-specific, co-created with local experts, teachers, communities to ensure relevance and impact. Diverse evidence and partnerships. So we discussed leveraging various types of evidence, such as education management data, monitoring, and evaluation systems and research collaborations with ministries, universities, NGOs, and think tanks. And the demand-driven knowledge products, this really struck me, whether it's a policy brief or perhaps a newspaper article, really tailoring knowledge to decision makers was highlighted. The point of John Wugo from the ZZ Africa Foundation about, ministers reading about what's happening in the newspaper, and really that we don't need one type of knowledge product, but different types of knowledge products that are tailored to the point in time, and sometimes something that's less academic can have significant impact as well. Aligning research with priorities, so co-creating certainly research with the decision makers, aligning it with education system priorities in order to really get system transformation. And then the point that Gita reinforced about, there's a clear desire to move beyond pilots, pilot programs to really focus on scaling evidence for broader system strengthening and transformation. We put a lot of emphasis on this in KIX to scale, what works in one jurisdiction or country to a number of other countries, but to scale it well, to learn from other countries' experiences, but also adjust to local contexts. And as you know, we have this accompanying project with Rosie, which is really learning on how to scale effectively. So these points were all really, really important and resonated with me and with IDRC's 50 years of experience in GPE KIX's goals. So I think that one of the other points that I make is just the importance of locally driven knowledge production with governments and institutions in the Global South leading the way. And that's really in IDRC's DNA and the way that, as you know, we are working with KIX. It's really the Global South institutions that are the most important, because those that are closest to a problem are really best placed to innovate to address it. So in terms of producing the knowledge, but also sharing it, and the point that Martha Akira, sorry, Martha, if I mispronounced your last name, the ministry representative from Kenya, sharing the knowledge with local communities in the vernacular is so powerful, and that really struck me as you said that this morning. So as we conclude day one, I'd like to thank everyone for your contributions today, especially the KIX team at the GP Secretariat, and also my own team for their hard work in organizing the panel today. And as Ian said, tomorrow we'll dive deeper into 4 thematic areas: out of school children and youth, data systems and data use, gender equality in and through education, and teacher professional development. So we'll hear findings from recent reports, examples of successful collaborations, and reflections from GPE thematic leads. And we'll have parallel sessions to have richer, smaller group discussions. So thank you again for your engagement today. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow as we continue these discussions. Bye-bye, everybody.